The Unlikeliest Hero, the true story of Audie Murphy. Part 1. The Red Dirt of Texas. The red dirt of Hunt County, Texas, had a way of staining everything it touched. It clung to boots with stubborn persistence, settled into the creases of work-worn hands like rust, and seemed to seep into the very soul of those who tried to coax a living from its unforgiving surface. In a weathered sharecropper's cabin near Kingston, where the walls led in winter wind and summer heat alike, a boy named Audie Leon Murphy learned his first lessons about survival long before he ever heard a shot fired in anger. Born on June 20th, 1925, Audie entered a world that offered little in the way of comfort or promise. He was the seventh of 12 children born to Emmett and Josie Bell Murphy, poor tenant farmers who moved frequently in search of work and better opportunities that never quite materialized. The Murphy family knew poverty intimately. Not the romantic, nostalgic poverty of old stories told around warm fires, but the grinding, desperate kind that leaves children hungry with distended bellies and parents hollow-eyed with worry that never quite leaves their faces. The cabin they lived in, one of many they would occupy over the years, consisted of 3 small rooms with gaps between the boards wide enough to see daylight through. In winter, the family stuffed rags and old newspapers into these gaps, but the wind still found its way inside, making sleep difficult on the coldest nights. In summer, the lack of insulation turned the cabin into an oven, and the family would sometimes sleep outside under the stars, preferring the mosquitoes to the suffocating heat. Audie's father, Emmett, was a man slowly being broken by circumstances he could neither control nor escape. He worked hard. No one could say otherwise. But hard work alone wasn't enough when you didn't own your land, when crop prices were set by others, when drought or flood could wipe out a year's labor in a single afternoon. Emmett began drinking to dull the pain of his failures, and when he drank, he sometimes became violent. Young Audie learned to read his father's moods, to know when to make himself scarce, to protect his younger siblings from Emmett's worst moments. Josie Bell Murphy was the family's anchor, a woman of fierce love and fiercer determination. She had been a schoolteacher before marriage, one of the few in her family to receive any education, and she tried to pass along what learning she could to her children. She taught them to read using a worn Bible and whatever newspapers or magazines she could find. She taught them arithmetic by having them help count and divide what little money came into the household. She taught them to believe that their circumstances didn't define their worth, that poverty was a condition, not a character flaw. But Josie was fighting a losing battle against more than just poverty. Her health was never good after bearing 12 children in quick succession, and the inadequate diet and lack of medical care took their toll. Still, she persevered with a strength that Audie would later recognize in himself, a refusal to surrender even when surrender would have been the easier path. Audie was a small child, even by the standards of a family where malnutrition was common. While his older brothers grew tall and strong, Audie remained slight, his frame seeming almost fragile. Other children sometimes teased him about his size, calling him runt or baby, taunts that stung more than Audie let show. But what he lacked in physical stature, he began to compensate for with quickness and determination. He learned to fight when necessary, using speed and cunning to overcome larger opponents. He learned that size wasn't everything, that heart and determination could level many playing fields. School, when Audie could attend, was a one-room building several miles from wherever the Murphy family was currently living. Attendance was sporadic, when there was work to be done on the farm, or when the family had to move to follow the sharecropping seasons. School became a luxury they couldn't afford. But Audie loved learning, absorbed every lesson like a plant drinking in rain after a drought. His teachers noticed his aptitude, particularly with numbers and problem solving. Given different circumstances, they told Josie Audie could go far. But circumstances weren't different, and such talk was just dreams. By the time Audie was 9 years old, he was already contributing meaningfully to the family's survival. He picked cotton alongside adults, his small fingers actually an advantage in reaching the bowls that grew deep in the plant. He tended the family's few chickens, collected eggs, and helped his mother with the vegetable garden that provided much of their food. And he hunted. The hunting began almost by accident. Emmett had an old single-shot .22 rifle, a battered weapon that had seen better days decades before. One afternoon, when rabbits were raiding the garden and Emmett was too drunk to do anything about it, young Audie took the rifle without permission. He'd watched his father shoot often enough, understood the basic mechanics. He loaded a single precious bullet, sighted on a rabbit 50 yards away, and fired. The rabbit died instantly, shot through the head. Audie felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride at his success, sadness at taking a life, and practical satisfaction that the family would eat meat that night. When Emmett sobered up and found out what Audie had done, he was angry at first. A child shouldn't be touching guns. But then he looked at the dead rabbit, looked at his small son, and something shifted. He began teaching Audie to shoot properly. Those lessons became some of Audie's few good memories of his father. In the fields and woods, away from the cabin and the weight of failed crops and unpaid debts, Emmett became a different man. He taught Audie about sight picture and breath control, about trigger squeeze and following through. He taught him to read animal signs, to move quietly, to have patience. Most importantly, he taught him that every bullet was precious, that waste was unforgivable, that you didn't shoot unless you were sure of your target and confident you could make the shot. Audie proved to be a natural marksman. His small hands were steady, his eyesight sharp, his natural patience perfectly suited to hunting. More than that, he had an almost supernatural ability to focus, to shut out everything except the target and the shot. Hours would pass as he sat motionless, waiting for game, his mind calm and clear in a way it rarely was in the chaos of the Murphy household. By the time he was 11, Audie was the family's primary hunter. Rabbits, squirrels, wild turkeys, the occasional deer. Anything that could be put on the table became his responsibility. He knew every tree, every gully, every good hunting spot within 5 miles of home. He learned to track wounded game, to read the weather, to predict where animals would be at different times of day. The skills he was developing, born of desperate necessity, were skills that most men twice his age didn't possess. Then came the day that changed everything. Audie was in the 5th grade, 11 years old, when his father simply walked away. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument. Emmett Murphy just left one morning and never came back. Perhaps he went looking for work and found something better than a family of 12 children he couldn't feed. Perhaps he simply couldn't bear the weight anymore. The family never learned the truth. Emmett was there one day, gone the next, and all the responsibility he'd been carrying fell on those he left behind. Josie tried to hold things together, but the math was impossible. A woman alone with 12 children, no income, no prospects. There was no path forward that didn't involve suffering. Audie, though only 11, understood this with a clarity that should have been beyond his years. He dropped out of school. There was no discussion, no alternatives to consider. The younger children needed food, and Audie was the one who could provide it. His education ended after 5th grade, but his real education was just beginning. Every day before dawn, Audie would take his rifle and whatever ammunition he'd managed to save or trade for and head into the woods. He would stay out until dark, hunting, trapping, doing whatever it took to bring back food. On good days, he might shoot 3 or 4 rabbits. On bad days, he might return empty-handed, and the family would go to bed with their stomachs cramping from hunger. The pressure was immense for a boy of 11. Every missed shot meant a missed meal. Every day without game meant another day of children crying from hunger, of his mother's face growing more drawn and exhausted. Audie learned to live with pressure, to function under it, to make it sharpen his focus rather than cloud it. These were lessons that would serve him well in a future he couldn't yet imagine. He also took odd jobs whenever he could find them. He picked cotton for neighboring farmers, earning a few pennies per 100 pounds picked. He pumped gas at a filling station on weekends. He did yard work, hauled trash, anything that might bring in a nickel or a dime. Every penny went to his mother, went to keeping the family fed and housed. There was nothing left over for a child's wants or needs. Audie wore clothes patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. His shoes were held together with wire and hope. But he never complained. Complaining accomplished nothing. The other Murphy children did what they could to help. The older ones found work where they could. The younger ones tended the garden, cared for the animals, helped their mother with household tasks. But it was never enough. The family was slowly starving, slowly losing ground in a battle they couldn't win. Josie's health deteriorated further. Without proper food or medical care, her body simply couldn't sustain the burden she was carrying. In 1941, when Audie was 16, Josie Belle Murphy died. The official cause was heart failure, but really she died of poverty and exhaustion and the slow grind of trying to keep 12 children alive with insufficient resources. Her death shattered what remained of the family structure. The children were parceled out, the youngest to an orphanage, others to relatives who could take them, the older ones to make their own way in the world. At 16, Audie found himself essentially alone. He stayed with various siblings when he could, slept in abandoned buildings when he couldn't, and continued to work any job that would have him. He pumped gas, picked cotton, hauled hay, did construction work when it was available. He was a grown man in a boy's body, with a man's responsibilities and a man's burdens but none of a man's resources or opportunities. Texas in 1941 was a hard place for a boy alone in the world. The Depression still lingered in rural areas, jobs were scarce, and a 16-year-old with a 5th-grade education had limited prospects. Audie might have lived out his life in obscurity, just another poor Texas kid who worked hard, struggled harder, and eventually died without leaving much mark on the world. Then came December 7th, 1941, and everything changed forever. The news came over the radio at the gas station where Audie was working. Japanese planes had attacked Pearl Harbor. Ships were sinking. Men were dying. America was going to war. In that moment, listening to the crackling radio report, something shifted in Audie Murphy. Here was a chance, maybe the only chance he'd ever get, to be something more than a poverty-stricken orphan with no future. Here was a chance to serve, to prove himself, to escape the trap that rural poverty represented. Within days, Audie walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station in Greenville, Texas. He was 16 years old, but claimed to be 18. He weighed barely 90 pounds and stood perhaps 5 feet tall in his worn boots. He looked the recruiter in the eye and said he wanted to fight for his country. The recruiter looked at this slip of a boy and tried not to laugh. The Marines had standards, he explained with patronizing kindness. They needed men who could handle the rigors of military service, who could carry the equipment, who could fight. Audie was too small, too young, too obviously unfit. Come back in a few years, the recruiter said, after you've grown some. Audie left the recruiting station with his jaw set and determination burning in his chest. If the Marines didn't want him, someone else would. He tried the paratroopers, rejected. He tried the Navy, rejected. Every branch of service looked at him and saw a child playing soldier, not a potential warrior. It was humiliating, infuriating, and it only made Audie more determined. For the next year and a half, as America mobilized for war and young men shipped out by the thousands, Audie Murphy worked his odd jobs and waited for his 18th birthday. He followed the war news religiously, reading every newspaper he could find, listening to every radio broadcast. He learned about the campaigns in North Africa, the fighting in the Pacific, the massive mobilization taking place. And he waited, counting down the days until he would be old enough to enlist without lying about his age. During this time, Audie continued to hunt, continued to shoot, continued to develop the skills that had kept his family alive. He didn't know it, but he was preparing himself for war in ways that boot camp never could. His ability to remain motionless for hours, to move silently, to shoot with deadly accuracy, to function under pressure and stress. These were skills that would mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. He also continued to grow, though not by much. By his 18th birthday, he'd reached his full adult height of 5 feet 5.5 inches. He weighed 112 pounds. He still looked young for his age, his face smooth and boyish, his build slight. But there was something in his eyes now, something hard and determined that hadn't been there before. The years of struggle had forged something in Audie Murphy, some core of steel that wouldn't bend or break. On June 20th, 1943, Audie Leon Murphy turned 18 years old. The next morning, he walked into an Army recruiting station in Greenville, Texas. This time, he met the minimum requirements, barely but enough. The recruiter, looking at this small young man with his worn clothes and intense gaze, hesitated. But the Army needed men, and Audie met the standards. He was sworn in, given his orders to report for basic training, and sent on his way. Audie Murphy was finally a soldier. The boy from the red dirt of Hunt County, Texas, was about to step onto a stage where he would become a legend. But the path ahead would be written in blood and fire, and it would cost him more than he could possibly imagine. Part 2: Becoming a Soldier. Camp Walters, Texas, in the summer of 1943 was a crucible designed to transform civilians into soldiers. The heat was oppressive, the dust omnipresent, and the drill instructors merciless in their efforts to break down recruits and rebuild them in the Army's image. For most of the young men who arrived there, it was a shocking introduction to military life. For Audie Murphy, it was almost familiar, just another form of hardship to endure and overcome. The physical training should have destroyed him. Audie weighed 112 pounds dripping wet, and much of the equipment he was expected to carry weighed half that. The M1 Garand rifle alone weighed nearly 10 pounds, and that was before adding ammunition, grenades, helmet, pack, and all the other gear an infantryman had to carry. Other recruits, many of whom were farm boys themselves and stood 6 feet tall or more, struggled with the weight. For Audie, it should have been impossible. But Audie had been carrying heavy loads since childhood, had been working from dawn to dark since he was old enough to work. His slight frame was all wire and muscle, his endurance born of years of necessity. While larger men collapsed during long marches, Audie kept moving, his face set in grim determination, refusing to show weakness. While others complained about the heat or the drill instructors or the endless physical demands, Audie simply endured. He'd survived worse. The obstacle courses were more challenging. His short legs put him at a disadvantage on some obstacles, and he lacked the upper body strength of larger men. But Audie was quick and agile, and he learned to use leverage and technique rather than raw strength. He might not be able to muscle his way over a wall, but he could find handholds and footholds that others missed. He might not be the fastest runner, but his conditioning from years of hunting meant he never tired. He finished every course, passed every test, met every standard. The other recruits initially viewed him with a mixture of amusement and pity. Here was this kid who looked like he should still be in high school, trying to keep up with grown men. Some tried to help him, others ignored him. A few actively hazed him, thinking he'd wash out quickly. But Audie didn't wash out. Day after day, week after week, he kept up. More than that, he began to excel in certain areas. The first time the recruits went to the rifle range was a revelation. Audie picked up his M1 Garand, the rifle that would become his constant companion in the years ahead, and it felt natural in his hands. It was heavier than the .22 he'd grown up with, the recoil stronger, but the fundamentals were the same. Sight picture, breath control, trigger squeeze, follow through. He'd been doing this since he was 9 years old. When the command came to fire, Audie's first shot struck center mass on the target at 100 yards. His second shot did the same. His third, fourth, fifth, every shot grouped so tightly that the range instructor initially thought there was a problem with the target or the scoring system. But there was no problem. Private Audie Murphy had just shot a perfect score. The instructor called Audie forward, examined him skeptically, then put him on a different target and watched. Again, Audie's shots grouped perfectly. The instructor increased the distance to 200 yards. Same result. 300 yards. Same result. Other instructors gathered to watch. Word spread. By the end of the day, Audie Murphy was legendary in his training company, the little kid who could shoot like nothing they'd ever seen. His shooting scores shattered company records, then battalion records. Officers came to watch him shoot, studying his technique, trying to understand what made him so effective. What they saw was economy of motion, absolute focus, and a preternatural calm. While other soldiers tensed up on the firing line, Audie relaxed. While others rushed their shots, Audie took his time. While others let pressure affect their performance, Audie seemed to thrive on it. But marksmanship was only part of what made a soldier. The army also needed men who could think under pressure, who could lead, who could make decisions when everything was chaos and confusion. These qualities were harder to teach and harder to measure, but they began to emerge in Audie as training progressed. During field exercises, when squads were given tactical problems to solve, Audie often saw solutions that others missed. He had an intuitive grasp of terrain, could visualize how a battle would unfold, understood instinctively where to position men for maximum effect. His suggestions, offered quietly and without presumption, were usually sound. Other soldiers began to listen when he spoke. His drill instructors noticed. Sergeant First Class William Henderson, the senior instructor for Audie's platoon, was a veteran of World War I who'd seen combat in France. He'd trained thousands of soldiers over the years and developed an instinct for identifying which ones would excel under fire. Henderson watched Audie carefully, saw beyond the slight build and youthful face to something deeper. One evening, Henderson called Audie aside after training. "Murphy," he said, "what do you want to do in the army?" "Infantry sergeant," Audie replied without hesitation. "I want to fight." Henderson studied him for a long moment. Most small men gravitated toward support roles where their size wouldn't be as much of a disadvantage. But here was this kid, looking like a strong wind might blow him over, volunteering for the most dangerous job in the army. "You know the life expectancy of an infantryman in combat?" Henderson asked. "I know, Sergeant. You know you're going to be carrying a rifle that weighs almost 10% of your body weight? That you're going to be marching 20 miles a day with a full pack? That bigger men are going to have advantages you don't?" "Yes, Sergeant." Henderson nodded slowly. "You can shoot, Murphy. Best I've ever seen. But shooting isn't everything. Combat is chaos. It's noise and confusion and fear. Men freeze up. Men break. Are you going to freeze up when bullets are flying and people are dying?" Audie met his eyes steadily. "No, Sergeant." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet certainty that wasn't bravado or machismo. Henderson had heard plenty of recruits brag about what they do in combat, how brave they'd be, how many enemies they'd kill. Those men usually folded when the reality hit them. But Murphy wasn't bragging. He was simply stating a fact. "All right," Henderson said. "We'll see." As basic training progressed into advanced infantry training, Audie continued to distinguish himself. He learned small unit tactics, how to lead a fire team, how to coordinate movement and fire. He learned about different weapons, machine guns, mortars, grenades, explosives. He learned map reading and land navigation. He learned battlefield medicine and how to care for wounded soldiers. He absorbed everything like a sponge, understanding that every piece of knowledge might someday mean the difference between life and death. The other soldiers in his unit had long since stopped underestimating him. Audie Murphy was no longer the little kid who looked out of place. He was one of the most capable soldiers in the company, and everyone knew it. When teams were chosen for exercises, soldiers wanted to be on Murphy's team. When someone needed help with shooting or tactics, they asked Murphy. When officers needed a soldier for a difficult or important task, they chose Murphy. In January 1944, after completing all his training, Private First Class Audie Murphy received his orders. He was being assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. The 3rd Infantry Division had a proud history stretching back to World War I, where it had fought in the Second Battle of the Marne. Its soldiers wore a shoulder patch with 3 diagonal white stripes on a blue background, symbolizing the division's 3 regiments. More importantly, the 3rd Infantry Division was a combat division. It had already seen heavy fighting in North Africa and Sicily and was currently engaged in the brutal Italian campaign. Being assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division meant Audie was going to war, and soon. He shipped out in early February 1944, crossing the Atlantic on a crowded troopship. The crossing took 2 weeks, and Audie spent much of it on deck, watching the endless ocean and thinking about what lay ahead. He wasn't afraid, or if he was, he didn't recognize it as fear. He felt anticipation, a sense of purpose, and underneath it all, a cold determination to prove himself, to show that size didn't matter, that he belonged. The ship docked in Naples, Italy, in late February. Audie Murphy was about to experience combat for the first time, and nothing in his training or his hard Texas childhood could fully prepare him for what was coming. Part 3, Baptism by Fire, Italy. Naples in February 1944 was a city of contrasts. Ancient buildings stood alongside bomb craters. Civilians tried to maintain some semblance of normal life while Allied soldiers flooded the streets, heading to and from the front lines. The harbor was crowded with ships unloading men and supplies, the machinery of war operating on a scale that staggered Audie's imagination. This was war not as abstract concept but as concrete reality. Thousands of tons of equipment, tens of thousands of men, all focused on the singular goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Audie and the other replacements were loaded onto trucks and driven north toward the front. The Italian countryside was beautiful despite the scars of war. Rolling hills covered in olive groves and vineyards, ancient stone farmhouses, narrow winding roads. But beauty was no protection against artillery fire, and even on the drive up, they could hear the distant rumble of guns, see smoke rising on the horizon. Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment was in reserve when Audie arrived, recovering from losses sustained in recent fighting. The company he joined bore little resemblance to the one that had landed in North Africa. Of the original soldiers who'd come ashore at Morocco in November 1942, fewer than 20 remained. The rest had been killed, wounded, or evacuated due to illness or injury. The men Audie met were a mix of combat veterans and newer replacements like himself, united by the shared knowledge that they were infantry soldiers in a war that consumed infantrymen at a horrifying rate. His platoon sergeant was a tough Tennessean named Brandon, a veteran of the North African and Sicilian campaigns. Brandon looked Audie over with undisguised skepticism. Another kid probably wouldn't last a week. But the army sent what it sent, and Brandon's job was to try to keep as many of them alive as possible. "Murphy," Brandon said, "you ever been shot at?"
"No, Sergeant."
"You scared?" Audie considered the question honestly. "I don't think so, Sergeant." Brandon grunted. "You will be. Everybody is. The trick is doing your job anyway. You stick with the experienced men, do what they do, and maybe you'll survive your first action. Probably not, but maybe." It was hardly an inspiring pep talk, but Audie appreciated the honesty. Brandon wasn't trying to sugarcoat reality, and Audie respected that. The sergeant ran through basic information: where the chow was, when to sleep, how to dig a proper foxhole, where the latrines were. Then he assigned Audie to a rifle squad led by Corporal Kerrigan, another veteran. Kerrigan was from Boston, spoke with an accent Audie sometimes had trouble understanding, and had a sardonic sense of humor that seemed at odds with the grim reality of their situation. But his squad respected him, which told Audie everything he needed to know. "Welcome to the glamorous infantry," Kerrigan said, shaking Audie's hand. "Where the accommodations are terrible, the food is worse, and the neighbors are actively trying to kill you. You'll love it." The other men in the squad introduced themselves. There was Laddie Tipton, a big farm boy from Iowa who reminded Audie of home. Brandon Pope from Georgia, who had a talent for scrounging supplies. Angelo Bellotti from New York, who spoke Italian and had proven invaluable during the campaign. And half a dozen others, each with their own story, their own reasons for being there. They treated Audie with cautious welcome. They'd seen too many replacements arrive with big talk and false bravado, only to freeze up or panic when the shooting started. Audie's slight build didn't inspire confidence, and his youthful appearance made him look even less capable than he was. But they didn't haze him or treat him badly. They just waited to see what he was made of. Combat would reveal his true character soon enough. For 3 days, Audie lived the life of an infantryman in reserve. He learned the real skills that training couldn't teach: how to sleep anywhere under any conditions, how to keep his weapon clean despite the ever-present dust and dirt, how to make coffee using helmet and heating tabs, how to write letters home on whatever scrap paper was available. He listened to the veterans' stories, absorbing lessons learned at terrible cost. Don't bunch up. Artillery and machine guns loved clustered targets. Keep your head down. German snipers were excellent marksmen. Don't touch anything the Germans left behind. Booby traps were everywhere. On the 4th day, the company received orders to move up to the front lines. They were to relieve elements of the 36th Infantry Division in positions near the town of Anzio, where Allied forces had been trapped in a beachhead for weeks, unable to break out due to fierce German resistance. The move up to the line happened at night. The soldiers marched in single file along muddy roads, each man keeping close enough to see the man ahead, but far enough apart that a single artillery shell couldn't kill multiple soldiers. No one talked. The only sounds were boots in mud, the clink of equipment, and the distant crump of artillery fire. Audie's first view of the Anzio beachhead came at dawn. They'd reached the front-line positions, and as the sun rose, Audie could see the battlefield spread out before him. It was a nightmare landscape. Shell craters pocked the earth. Trees had been reduced to splintered stumps. Buildings were shattered ruins. And everywhere, there were signs of the fighting that had raged here. Destroyed tanks, abandoned equipment, hastily dug graves. The positions they were taking over consisted of a series of foxholes and shallow trenches. The soldiers they were relieving looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, moving with the sluggish fatigue of men who hadn't slept properly in weeks. They gave quick briefings. German positions were 300 yards ahead in that tree line. Machine gun nest over there, sniper active near that farmhouse, artillery falls regularly around noon and at dusk. Then they were gone, trudging back toward the rear, and Company B owned this piece of hell. Audie was placed in a foxhole with Laddie Tipton. They improved the position as best they could, deepening it, building up the front with sandbags, creating overhead cover using wood and dirt. It was exhausting work, but veterans like Kerrigan insisted it was necessary. Better to be tired now than dead later. "You'll get used to it," Tipton said as they worked. He was a friendly sort, seemed genuinely interested in making Audie feel welcome. "First few days are the worst. Everything's strange, you jump at every sound, you can't sleep. But it gets more routine." "How long have you been here?" Audie asked. "At Anzio? 3 weeks. With the company? Since Sicily. I'm practically an old-timer." He laughed without much humor. "Lost count of how many replacements I've seen come and go. Some guys last 10 minutes. Some last 10 days. Few make it longer than that." The comment was sobering, but Audie appreciated the honesty. "What's the secret to lasting?" Tipton paused in his digging, considering. "Luck mostly, but also paying attention. Don't volunteer for anything. Don't be a hero. Don't take unnecessary risks. Keep your head down, do your job, and hope the bullet with your name on it misses." They finished their foxhole and settled in to wait. Waiting, Audie would learn, was what soldiers did most of the time. Waiting for orders, waiting for food, waiting for relief, waiting for the enemy to do something. The boredom was punctuated by moments of terror so intense they seemed to distort time itself. His first experience of combat came that afternoon. Audie was in his foxhole, eating a can of cold rations, when he heard a sound like a freight train approaching. Instinct made him duck, pressing himself flat against the bottom of the foxhole. A split second later, the world exploded. The artillery shell hit 30 yards away, the blast wave washing over him, the sound so loud it seemed to come from inside his skull. Dirt and debris rained down. His ears rang. For a moment, he couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. Then training kicked in, and he checked himself for wounds, checked his weapon, looked around to assess the situation. More shells were falling, dozens of them, crashing down across the company's position. This was a German artillery barrage, something the veterans had warned about but which nothing could truly prepare you for until you experienced it. The noise was indescribable. Not just sound but physical pressure, Each explosion felt as much as heard. The ground shook. The air filled with dirt and smoke and the smell of high explosive. Audie curled up in his foxhole, making himself as small as possible, and waited for it to end. There was nothing else to do. You couldn't fight back against artillery. You couldn't see who was trying to kill you. You could only endure and hope your foxhole provided enough protection. Hope that none of the shells landed directly on you. Hope that you'd survive the next few minutes. The barrage lasted 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, and then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the ringing silence that followed, Audie heard men calling out, checking on each other, calling for medics. He raised his head cautiously, looked around. The landscape had changed subtly, new craters, more destruction, more chaos. "You okay, Murphy?" Tipton called from the next foxhole over. "Yeah," Audie called back, surprised to find it was true. He was okay. Shaken, ears ringing, covered in dirt, but unharmed. He'd survived his first brush with combat. "Congratulations," Kerrigan said, appearing at the foxhole's edge with a cynical grin. "You're officially a combat veteran now. Only a few thousand more barrages to survive before you get to go home." That night, Audie experienced his first firefight. German infantry probed the American lines, trying to identify weak spots, testing defenses. The attack came without warning. One moment quiet darkness, the next moment muzzle flashes and the crack of rifle fire, the stutter of machine guns, the crump of mortars. "Contact front!" someone yelled, and suddenly everyone was firing. Audie saw shapes moving in the darkness, raised his M1 Garand, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. He worked the action, fired again. Again. The training took over, bypassing conscious thought. Aim, fire, work the bolt. Aim, fire. Don't think about the fact that those shapes are men. Don't think about what your bullets are doing when they hit. Just shoot. The German probe lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the attackers faded back into the darkness. When it was over, Audie realized he was breathing hard, his heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his system. But he hadn't frozen. He'd functioned. He'd done his job. "Good shooting, kid," Kerrigan said, dropping into the foxhole beside him. "You hit anything?" "I don't know," Audie admitted. "Well, you didn't freeze up, which is more than some guys manage their first time. Keep that up and you might actually survive this war." As February gave way to March, Audie settled into the rhythm of combat. Days blurred together, boredom punctuated by terror, waiting punctuated by violence. He learned to sleep through distant artillery fire but wake instantly at closer sounds. He learned to identify German weapons by their sound, the rapid BRRRP of an MG-42 machine gun, the crack of a Mauser rifle, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. He learned to move through terrain using whatever cover was available. He learned where to look for German positions, how to spot camouflage, how to identify good firing positions. And he killed. By the end of his first month in combat, Audie Murphy had killed at least a dozen enemy soldiers. He didn't keep count, didn't dwell on it, tried not to think too much about the fact that each target in his sights had been a person with a life and family and dreams. They were the enemy, they were trying to kill him and his friends, and stopping them was his job. It was that simple and that complicated. The other soldiers in his squad no longer treated him like a new guy. He'd proven himself, shown that he could function under fire, that he could be relied upon. When German positions needed to be taken out, when dangerous patrols needed volunteers, Audie's name came up. Not because he sought glory or attention, but because he was effective, and effectiveness kept people alive. In early April, during a German counterattack near the village of Cisterna, Audie demonstrated for the first time the qualities that would make him legendary. His squad was pinned down by a German machine gun position, unable to move forward or retreat without taking casualties. They'd been stuck for 20 minutes, and the Germans were beginning to work their way around to flank them. Kerrigan, the squad leader, was desperately trying to call in artillery support, but the radio wasn't working properly. Other squads were engaged in their own fights and couldn't help. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Audie, lying in a shell crater with bullets snapping overhead, studied the German position. It was in a partially destroyed building about 70 yards away. The machine gun had good fields of fire, covered all the obvious approaches. Any direct assault would be suicidal. But there was dead ground, a small depression in the terrain that ran almost to the building's flank. If someone could reach that depression without being seen, they could work their way close enough to use grenades. "I can get to it," Audie told Kerrigan. Kerrigan looked at him, looked at the German position, shook his head. "Too risky. We'll wait for support. We don't have time. They're flanking us." It was true. German infantry were visible moving through a grove of olive trees to the squad's right, trying to get behind them. In a few more minutes, the squad would be surrounded. Audie didn't wait for permission. He gathered 3 grenades, checked his rifle, and before Kerrigan could stop him, he was moving. He crawled on his belly, using every fold in the ground, every bit of cover. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. The Germans had spotted his movement, but he kept going, his heart pounding but his mind clear and focused. He reached the depression, followed it to the building's flank. The machine gun was still firing, focused on where the main squad was pinned down. Audie pulled the pin on his first grenade, counted 3 seconds, then threw it through a window of the building. The explosion was muffled by the walls, but the machine gun fell silent. Audie didn't stop. He threw his second grenade, then his third, clearing the building. Then he was on his feet, rifle ready, moving through the building's doorway. He found 3 German soldiers, 1 dead from the grenades, 2 wounded. He secured them quickly, efficiently, without thought. "Clear!" he shouted to his squad. The squad moved up, secured the position. The flanking German infantry, seeing that the machine gun position had fallen, withdrew. The immediate crisis was over, and Audie Murphy had resolved it through individual action that any objective observer would call reckless but which had worked perfectly. Sergeant Brandon, the platoon sergeant, chewed Audie out for taking such a risk without orders. But Lieutenant Colonel Michael Pollock, the battalion commander who heard about the action, put Audie in for a Bronze Star. It was his first medal, and it established a pattern that would repeat throughout his combat service. Audie seeing a problem, Audie solving it through direct action, Audie's superiors alternating between exasperation at his risk-taking and admiration for his effectiveness. By May 1944, when the 3rd Infantry Division was finally withdrawn from Anzio to prepare for the invasion of southern France, Audie Murphy was no longer a replacement. He was a veteran tried and tested in some of the most brutal fighting of the Italian campaign. He'd been promoted to corporal. He'd earned the respect of his peers, and he'd learned that he possessed something rare and valuable: the ability to function at peak effectiveness under the worst possible conditions, to remain calm when others panicked, to make good decisions when everything was chaos. But Italy had been just the beginning. France awaited, and with it, battles that would test Audie Murphy in ways that even the hell of Anzio hadn't managed. Part 4. Operation Dragoon, Southern France. The summer of 1944 brought a welcome respite for the 3rd Infantry Division. pulled off the line in Italy. The division moved to Naples for rest, refitting, and preparation for the next operation. For Audie and the other combat veterans, the break was desperately needed. They slept in actual buildings, ate hot food regularly, and had time to write letters, read, and engage in activities that didn't involve someone trying to kill them. But the break couldn't erase what they'd experienced. Audie found he couldn't sleep without nightmares. Every night brought dreams of firefights, artillery barrages, dead friends. He would wake in the darkness, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, his heart pounding, sweat soaking his uniform. He didn't talk about this with anyone. Soldiers didn't complain about nightmares. You just dealt with it and moved on. The company had changed significantly since Audie's arrival. Of the men he'd first met, several were dead. More were wounded and evacuated. Others had broken down mentally and been sent to the rear. New replacements arrived constantly, young faces full of fear and false bravado, and Audie found himself in the strange position of being a veteran at 19 years old, someone the new guys looked to for guidance. He'd been promoted to sergeant in June, given command of his own squad. It was a responsibility that weighed on him. These men would follow his orders, trust his judgment, and if he made mistakes, they would die. Audie studied leadership, watched how the best sergeants and officers operated, absorbed lessons about how to keep men alive while still accomplishing the mission. The trick, Sergeant Brandon told him one evening over coffee, is to care about your men but not too much. You care enough to make good decisions, to not waste their lives. But you can't care so much that you can't function when they die. Because they will die, Murphy. You'll make all the right calls, do everything perfectly, and men will still die because that's what happens in war. It was a brutal lesson, but Audie understood it. He'd already lost friends, already learned that combat was ultimately arbitrary. The bullet that killed one man passed harmlessly by another, and there was no justice or sense to it. You did your best to improve the odds, but you couldn't control everything. In August 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division participated in Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. The landings took place on August 15th near the coastal towns of Saint-Tropez and Fréjus. Unlike the heavily contested landings at Normandy or even Anzio, the Dragoon landings faced relatively light opposition. The Germans in southern France were already reeling from the Normandy breakout and couldn't afford to commit large forces to stop the invasion. Audie's company went ashore in the second wave, expecting fierce resistance that never materialized. The beach was chaotic but not deadly, filled with men and equipment but not enemy fire. By nightfall, the division had pushed several miles inland, and it was clear that the Germans were retreating rather than fighting for every inch of ground. The rapid advance brought its own challenges. As the infantry pushed north, chasing the retreating Germans, supply lines stretched thin. Units sometimes found themselves ahead of friendly forces on their flanks, vulnerable to German counterattacks. The fighting, when it came, was sharp and vicious. Small unit actions, ambushes, fierce little battles over bridge crossings or road junctions. In late August, near the town of Montelimar, Audie's platoon ran into a German rearguard position. The Germans had established a blocking position on a hill overlooking the road the Americans needed to use. Machine guns covered all the approaches, and the Germans had clear fields of fire that made any assault extremely dangerous. The platoon lieutenant, a young officer named Robert Nett who'd joined the unit just before the invasion, studied the position through binoculars. "We need that hill," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Division wants this road open by nightfall. It'll cost us," Sergeant Brandon observed. Maybe half the platoon dead or wounded if we go straight at it. Audie had been studying the terrain, considering options. What if we don't go straight at it? He suggested. Both officers looked at him. What are you thinking, Sergeant Murphy? Lieutenant Nett asked. Audie pointed to a wooded ravine that ran along the hill's eastern side. That ravine provides concealment almost to their position. If we can get into it without being spotted, we can work our way up close, hit them from the flank where they're not expecting it. The approach to that ravine is exposed, Brandon noted. They'd spot us. Not if we wait until dusk. Another hour, and the light will be low enough that we can make it across. Once we're in the ravine, we're concealed by the terrain and vegetation. Lieutenant Nett considered the plan. It was risky. If the Germans spotted them crossing to the ravine, they'd be caught in the open. But it was less risky than a frontal assault, and the timeline was tight. All right, Murphy, take your squad plus Sergeant Tipton's squad. Wait for dusk, then move into that ravine. When you're in position, fire a green flare. The rest of us will assault from the front to fix their attention. You hit them from the flank. An hour later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon and shadows lengthened across the fields, Audie led his 12-man element across the exposed ground toward the ravine. They moved fast but carefully, using what little cover existed. Audie expected at any moment to hear the chatter of German machine guns, to see men falling around him. But the Germans, focused on the obvious approach from the American positions, didn't spot the flanking movement. They reached the ravine without incident and began working their way up through the brush and trees. It was slow going, they had to be quiet, couldn't afford to give away their position. Audie moved carefully, testing each footfall, using hand signals to direct his men. The sounds of the German position grew louder as they climbed, voices speaking German, the clink of equipment, the rattle of machine gun belts being loaded. After 30 minutes of careful movement, Audie reached a position on the German flank, perhaps 40 yards from their main position. He could see the machine gun nests, could see German soldiers moving around, completely unaware that American troops were so close. He pulled out his flare gun, loaded a green flare, and fired it into the darkening sky. The flare arced up, burst in a shower of green light, and immediately the night exploded with gunfire. Lieutenant Nett's element opened up from the front, machine guns and rifles all firing together. The Germans, taken by surprise, began returning fire, focused entirely on the threat they could see. Audie and his element opened fire from the flank. They had perfect enfilade fire, shooting directly into the German position from the side. German soldiers fell, scrambling for cover that didn't exist against this new threat. Audie threw grenades, his squad doing the same, the explosions adding to the chaos. Within minutes, the German position was untenable. Those who could fled. Those who couldn't surrendered. The hill was secured with minimal American casualties. 2 men slightly wounded from flying debris, none killed. It was a textbook example of fire and maneuver, of using terrain and tactics to achieve victory with minimal cost. And it further established Audie Murphy's reputation as a soldier who could see solutions others missed, who could execute complex plans under pressure, who got results. Lieutenant Nett put Audie in for a Bronze Star with V device for valor, for the action. More importantly, word spread through the battalion about Sergeant Murphy, the little guy who kept pulling off impossible missions, who had nerves of steel and tactical genius beyond his years and inexperience. As September progressed and the 3rd Infantry Division pushed northeast through France, Audie participated in dozens of similar actions. Some went smoothly, others became desperate fights for survival. He lost men from his squad, saw friends killed by artillery or machine gun fire or snipers. Each loss hit him hard, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were always more missions, more objectives, more battles to fight. In late September, near the town of Clury, Audie received a field promotion to second lieutenant. Battlefield commissions were relatively rare. Most officers came from Officer Candidate School or West Point. But the Army recognized that leadership ability didn't always correlate with formal education, and occasionally a truly exceptional soldier could be commissioned directly from the enlisted ranks. The promotion meant more responsibility but not fundamentally different duties. Audie was now a platoon leader rather than a squad leader, responsible for 35 to 40 men rather than 12. The men he led, many of them older than he was, accepted the promotion without resentment. They'd seen Audie in action, knew he was capable, and that was all that mattered. As October arrived and the 3rd Infantry Division approached the German border, the fighting grew fiercer. The Germans were falling back on their homeland now, fighting with the desperation of men protecting their own territory. Every village, every hill, every river crossing became a battle. Casualties mounted, and the division's advance slowed to a crawl. Audie's platoon was in constant action. They cleared villages, established defensive positions, repelled counterattacks, and advanced again. Audie led from the front, exposing himself to danger alongside his men, and his soldiers appreciated that. He never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. In early October, during the fighting around Bruyères, Audie earned his first Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. His platoon had been tasked with clearing a fortified German position on a wooded hill. The assault began normally enough, but German resistance was fiercer than expected. Machine gun fire raked the American positions, pinning down 2 squads and killing several men. Audie, seeing his platoon stalled and taking casualties, made a decision. He called for all available smoke grenades to be thrown forward, creating a smoke screen. Then, before anyone could stop him, he was moving forward through the smoke, alone, toward the German positions. What followed was a display of combat prowess that seemed almost superhuman. Audie worked his way through the German defensive line, using grenades and his carbine, moving from position to position. He killed or captured 2 machine gun crews, destroyed a mortar position, and cleared multiple fighting holes. His action broke the German defense and allowed his platoon to advance and secure the objective. When the smoke cleared and his platoon reached the hilltop, they found Audie calmly reloading his carbine, surrounded by dead and wounded Germans. He'd single-handedly broken a defensive position that should have required a company-sized assault. "Jesus Christ, Murphy," one of his sergeants said, staring at the carnage. "What the hell were you thinking?" Audie looked at him with mild surprise. "I was thinking we needed to take this hill, and men were dying. So I took it." It was that simple to him. There was an objective, there were obstacles to that objective, and he'd removed the obstacles. The personal risk involved barely registered in his decision-making process. His ability to compartmentalize, to shut off fear and hesitation and simply act, was what made him so effective and so dangerous to himself. The Distinguished Service Cross citation described his actions as extraordinary heroism, and noted that his inspiring leadership and disregard for personal safety enabled his unit to achieve its objective with minimal casualties. What it didn't mention was that Audie's disregard for personal safety was starting to worry his superiors. Officers were supposed to lead, but they were also supposed to survive. Audie seemed to have no regard for the latter consideration. As the division approached the Vosges Mountains in late October, Audie Murphy was 20 years old, had been in combat for 8 months, and had already established himself as one of the most decorated soldiers in the division. But the worst fighting of his war was still ahead, and it would take place in the dense, dark forests of the Vosges, where men died in numbers that seemed incomprehensible even by the brutal standards of World War II infantry combat. Part 5: The Vosges Mountains. The Vosges Mountains in October 1944 were a vision of hell disguised as picturesque European countryside. Dense forests of pine and fir-covered steep slopes, their beauty hiding deadly dangers. The Germans had turned these mountains into a fortress, using the terrain to create defensive positions that would have made any attacker pause. Machine gun nests commanded every approach. Artillery observers had perfect views of American positions, and the thick forest made air support nearly impossible. The 3rd Infantry Division's mission was to break through the Vosges and reach the Rhine River plain beyond. On paper, it was straightforward. In reality, it meant attacking uphill through dense forest against an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and had prepared extensive defenses. It meant fighting in conditions where visibility was measured in yards, where artillery support was difficult, where every advance came at the cost of blood. Audie's platoon entered the Vosges in late October, and immediately the character of the fighting changed. In open country, soldiers could see enemies, could maneuver, could call in airstrikes or artillery with good effect. In the Vosges, combat happened at point-blank range in near-zero visibility. You couldn't see German positions until you were practically on top of them. Artillery support often fell on friendly forces because forward observers couldn't see through the canopy. Every tree might hide an enemy soldier. Every shadow might be death waiting. The weather made everything worse. November brought cold rain that turned the forest floor into mud. Soldiers were constantly wet, constantly cold, constantly exhausted. Trench foot became epidemic. The simple act of moving through the forest was exhausting. Clambering over fallen logs, pushing through thick undergrowth, climbing steep slopes while carrying 80 pounds of equipment. Resupply became a nightmare. Everything, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, had to be carried forward by hand. Companies would send back entire squads just to bring up ammunition, and even then they ran short. Wounded men had to be carried out the same way, through miles of forest trail, often under fire. More than one wounded soldier died not from his wound, but from the hours-long journey back to medical treatment. In early November, Audie's platoon was tasked with taking a German-held position identified on maps as Hill 623, just another numbered hill in the Vosges, distinguished only by the German observation post at its summit. Intelligence suggested light resistance, perhaps a squad of Germans with a few machine guns. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Audie led his platoon up the hill in the pre-dawn darkness of November 3rd. They moved carefully, knowing that the Germans often established ambushes on likely approaches. The forest was silent except for their own carefully muffled sounds. Boots in mud, the rustle of equipment, labored breathing as they climbed. They were 2/3 of the way up when the world exploded. German machine guns opened fire from multiple positions, pre-sighted on the trail Audie's platoon was using. The first burst killed 3 men instantly. Others dove for cover, scrambling behind trees and rocks as bullets tore through the forest. Mortar rounds began falling, air bursting in the tree canopy, sending deadly fragments raining down on the pinned Americans. The platoon was caught in a perfect kill zone. Machine gun fire came from at least 4 positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that made movement suicidal. The Germans had let them get deep into the kill zone before opening fire, and now they were systematically destroying the platoon. Men were screaming, some from wounds, others just terror. In the chaos and near darkness, it was almost impossible to identify where the German fire was coming from. Audie's radio operator was dead, hit in the opening burst, so calling for artillery support was impossible without working back down the trail to company headquarters. Staying where they were meant slow annihilation. Retreating meant exposing themselves during movement, likely resulting in even more casualties. Audie made his decision in seconds. The only way out was through. They had to assault the German positions, close with them so the enemy couldn't use their superior firepower. It was almost suicidal, but staying put was definitely suicidal. Assault through. Audie shouted over the din of gunfire. Everyone, assault through. Move, move, move. He stood up, fully exposed to German fire, and began moving uphill, firing his carbine as he advanced. It was an act of either transcendent courage or complete madness, standing up in a machine gun kill zone and charging toward the guns. But it was also the right tactic, and his soldiers, seeing their lieutenant standing and moving, forced themselves to follow. The platoon surged forward. Men fell, hit by machine gun fire, torn apart by exploding mortar rounds. But the survivors kept moving, driven by momentum and Audie's example and the desperate knowledge that stopping meant death. They threw grenades ahead of them, fired their weapons, screamed battle cries that were half rage and half terror. They reached the first German machine gun position, Audie leading the way. He killed the crew with a combination of grenades and point-blank rifle fire, then immediately moved to the next position. His soldiers spread out, assaulting other German positions, the fighting now hand-to-hand in some places, men grappling with knives and rifle butts. The German defense broke. Survivors fell back to secondary positions, and Audie's platoon, what was left of it, secured the first line of enemy fortifications. They'd won, but the cost had been horrific. Of the 37 men who'd started up the hill, 19 were casualties, 8 dead, 11 wounded. Audie moved among his wounded, offering what comfort he could, directing treatment, calling for litter bearers. He felt hollow inside, drained not just physically but emotionally. He'd led men into a meat grinder and survived while better men died. The guilt was crushing, even though intellectually he knew he'd made the only decision possible. And the hill still wasn't fully secured. The Germans still held the summit with its observation post. More fighting lay ahead. His company commander, Captain Harold, reached Audie's position with reinforcements an hour later. He looked at the carnage, looked at Audie's depleted platoon, and made a decision. Murphy, take your platoon back down. You've done enough. I'll bring up fresh troops for the summit. Audie wanted to protest, wanted to argue that his platoon had started this, should finish it, but one look at his men told him Captain Harold was right. They were physically and mentally exhausted, their ammunition was low, and they'd taken too many casualties. Fresh troops would be more effective. The platoon stumbled back down the hill, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead to be retrieved later. By the time they reached the company position at the base of the hill, Audie was moving mechanically, running on willpower alone. He got his men settled, made sure the wounded were evacuated, wrote letters to the families of the dead. Then he found a corner of a foxhole and collapsed, asleep almost before he finished lying down. He slept for 4 hours and dreamed of machine gun fire and screaming men, and woke with his hands shaking and sweat on his face despite the cold. Another day in the Vosges, another day of surviving. The fighting continued without let up. Every day brought new objectives, another hill to take, another German position to clear, Another advance measured in hundreds of yards bought at the cost of lives. The names blurred together: Hill 623, Hill 555, the Forêt de Parouille, the woods near Rambervillers. Each one cost the division casualties it couldn't easily replace. Each one brought the American forces a little closer to breaking through the German defenses. Audie was promoted to first lieutenant in mid-November, giving him command of the entire company when Captain Harold was wounded. At 19 years old, he was responsible for nearly 200 men, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. Every order he gave sent men into danger. Every decision affected who lived and who died. And there was no escape from it, no break, no moment when he could set the burden down. He began having trouble sleeping. Not just nightmares, though those continued, but actual insomnia. He would lie awake for hours, mind racing, replaying every decision, wondering if he could have done something differently, saved more lives. When he did sleep, it was light and fitful, waking at every sound. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his uniform hanging loose on his already slight frame. Other officers noticed and worried. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware, the battalion commander, called Audie in for a meeting. "Murphy, you look like hell," Ware said bluntly. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" Audie couldn't remember. "I'm fine, sir. Just tired like everyone else." "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground. I'm thinking about pulling you back, giving you a rest." The suggestion sent alarm through Audie. "Sir, please don't. My men need me. I can't leave them." Ware studied him for a long moment. "Your men need you effective, not exhausted. But all right, I won't pull you yet. But Murphy, listen to me, you can't save everyone. Men are going to die no matter what you do. The best officers learn to accept that. The ones who can't accept it destroy themselves trying." Audie nodded, but he didn't truly hear the advice. How could he accept his men dying when every death felt like a personal failure? How could he not try to save everyone when they were depending on him? In late November, during the fighting around the town of Holtzwihr, Audie contracted a severe case of influenza. He was feverish, weak, could barely stand. The medics wanted to evacuate him, but Audie refused. His company was about to attack, and he wouldn't abandon them. He drank water, took what medicine was available, and led his men into battle with a fever of 103 degrees. The attack succeeded, but Audie's physical condition deteriorated further. He developed a severe infection, possibly from drinking contaminated water, possibly from an untreated minor wound he'd ignored. By early December, he could no longer hide his condition. He was evacuated to a field hospital, where doctors discovered he'd been fighting with not just influenza but also a dangerous bacterial infection that had gone untreated for weeks. "You're lucky to be alive," the doctor told him. "Another few days and this infection could have killed you. Why didn't you report to medical earlier?" Audie didn't have a good answer. The truth that he felt responsible for his men, that he couldn't imagine leaving them, sounded irrational even to him. So he just shrugged. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital, recovering his strength, gaining back a few of the pounds he'd lost. The rest did him good physically, but mentally he was restless, worried about his company, guilty about not being with them. When the doctors finally cleared him for return to duty, he immediately rejoined his unit. The 3rd Infantry Division had pushed through the Vosges while Audie was hospitalized and was now engaged in the Alsace region, fighting around the Colmar Pocket, a German-held salient that threatened Allied lines of communication. Audie returned to his company on January 20th, 1945, and was immediately told they had a mission the next day. The mission was to advance across open ground near the village of Holtzwihr and secure a tree line held by German forces. It was a straightforward objective, though the open ground made for a dangerous approach. But orders were orders, and Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment would carry out its mission as always. Neither Audie Murphy nor anyone else in the company could have known that the next day, January 26, 1945, would be the day that changed everything. The day when a young lieutenant from Texas would perform an action so extraordinary, so seemingly impossible, that it would earn him the Medal of Honor and cement his place in military history. But that story deserves its own telling. Part 6, January 26, 1945, the Day of Days. The morning of January 26, 1945, dawned cold and clear over the Alsace region of France. The temperature hovered near freezing, and a blanket of snow covered the ground, pristine white that would soon be stained red. Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment was positioned in and around the small village of Holtzwihr, preparing for a mission that seemed routine by the standards of what they'd experienced. Their objective was to advance across approximately 400 yards of open, snow-covered field and secure a tree line held by German forces. Intelligence indicated the Germans were weak in this sector, perhaps a company-sized unit with limited armored support. The attack was scheduled for mid-morning, giving the troops time to organize and prepare. Audie Murphy, back with his company for just one day after his hospitalization, was in command of Company B's 1st Platoon. He'd spent the morning checking on his men, ensuring their weapons were clean and functioning, making sure everyone understood the plan. The soldiers, many of them new replacements since he'd been away, seemed confident. The open ground was intimidating, but they'd have tank destroyer support, and the German position didn't appear heavily fortified. At 9:30 a.m., the attack began. Company B moved out of Holtzwihr in good order, infantry advancing across the snowy field with tank destroyers providing overwatch from positions in the village. The morning was quiet, almost peaceful. Birds could be heard in the trees. The snow crunched underfoot. Felt nothing like the start of a battle. They'd advanced perhaps 100 yards when the first artillery shell fell. Then another and another. German artillery observers in the tree line had spotted the American advance and called in fire. Shells crashed down across the field, throwing up geysers of snow and frozen earth. Men fell, wounded or killed by shrapnel. The attack faltered as soldiers sought what little cover the open field provided. Audie called for smoke to obscure their movement, and within minutes, smoke rounds were impacting between the advancing Americans and the German positions, creating a gray curtain. The company resumed its advance through the smoke, making another 50 yards before the German artillery shifted, bracketing them again with deadly accuracy. Then the situation deteriorated catastrophically. 6 German Panther tanks emerged from the tree line, their 75mm guns and machine guns opening fire on the exposed Americans. Behind the tanks came approximately 250 German infantry, advancing in a counterattack that intelligence hadn't predicted or detected. This wasn't a depleted company defending. This was a reinforced German unit launching a deliberate counterattack. The American tank destroyers engaged the Panthers, scoring hits but failing to penetrate the thick German armor. One destroyer was hit and burst into flames, its crew bailing out and running for the American lines. The other destroyers, outgunned and out-armored, began pulling back to more defensible positions. Company B was caught in the open with German tanks and infantry advancing toward them. Audie made the only decision possible: order a fighting withdrawal back to the village. His company began falling back in good order, squads leapfrogging rearward while others provided covering fire. It was textbook infantry tactics, but they were being pressed hard by superior force. One of the tank destroyers, the M10 commanded by Sergeant Elmer Brawley, was hit by a Panther round that penetrated the turret, killing the gunner instantly. The vehicle didn't explode but caught fire, thick black smoke pouring from the turret. Brawley and the remaining crew bailed out, leaving the burning vehicle behind as they retreated to the American lines. The burning tank destroyer sat in the snow about 40 yards from the nearest German forces, clearly visible to both sides. Its machine gun, a .50 caliber M2 Browning, was still intact, its ammunition hadn't cooked off yet, and it had a commanding view of the field. It was also completely exposed, sitting in the open with smoke and flames making it even more visible. German infantry were advancing around both sides of it. Audie Murphy looked at that burning tank destroyer and made a decision that defied every survival instinct, every tactic taught in training, every reasonable assessment of risk. He ran across the open ground to the burning vehicle, climbed onto it despite the flames and the possibility of ammunition cooking off and exploding at any moment, and manned the .50 caliber machine gun. From this exposed position, standing on a burning vehicle that could explode without warning, in full view of several hundred German soldiers and 6 Panther tanks, Audie Murphy began directing the defense of Company B's position. The Germans, seeing this lone American on the burning tank destroyer, directed enormous amounts of fire at him. Panther tanks fired their main guns, missing by feet. Their machine guns raked the destroyer with tracer fire. German infantry fired rifles and submachine guns from increasingly close range. Artillery shells bracketed the position, throwing up snow and debris. And through it all, Audie remained calm, methodical, deadly. He worked the .50 caliber with practiced efficiency, firing controlled bursts at the advancing German infantry. The heavy machine gun, designed for use against vehicles and fortifications, was devastating against personnel. When groups of Germans tried to advance, Audie cut them down. When they took cover, he traversed the gun and found them. When they attempted to flank his position, he swung the gun to meet them, calling corrections to the American artillery to break up their attacks. He was also on the phone. The tank destroyer's communications equipment still worked, and Audie used it to coordinate the entire company's defense. He called out German positions, directed fire from his soldiers still in the village, called in artillery strikes danger close to his own position. At one point, he called in artillery that landed less than 30 yards from where he stood, so close the blast wave could be felt, so close that German soldiers were killed by the same shells that threw debris onto the tank destroyer where Audie stood. The German infantry, advancing in waves, couldn't understand why this single American wouldn't die. They could see him clearly, a small figure standing on the burning vehicle, working the machine gun with mechanical precision. They shot at him hundreds of times. Tanks fired at him. Artillery fell around him. But he wouldn't go down, wouldn't stop, wouldn't yield an inch of ground. Time became meaningless on that burning tank destroyer. Audie fired until the .50 caliber's barrel was glowing red-hot, then kept firing. He went through belt after belt of ammunition, reloading with practice speed while still scanning for targets. He fought off not just one German assault but multiple waves, each time forcing them back with accurate fire and well-directed artillery. His soldiers, watching from the village, were transfixed. Many of them would later say they'd never seen anything like it, and many of them were combat veterans who'd seen incredible acts of courage. But this was different. This was one man, exposed and alone, holding off an entire German company supported by armor. It shouldn't have been possible, but it was happening right before their eyes. The German commander, recognizing that the attack was foundering on this single American position, attempted to flank around Audie's location. German infantry worked their way through dead ground, trying to reach the village from the sides. But Audie saw them, called out their positions, and directed fire that stopped each flanking attempt before it could develop. His tactical awareness, even while personally engaged in firing the machine gun, was extraordinary. After what combat reports would later determine was approximately 1 hour, though accounts varied, with some soldiers saying it seemed much longer, the German attack finally broke. They'd taken appalling casualties, lost the initiative, and failed to achieve their objective. The survivors withdrew back to the tree line, leaving the field covered with their dead and wounded. Only then did Audie Murphy climb down from the burning tank destroyer. The vehicle's ammunition finally began cooking off as he stepped away, rounds exploding in the fire, the vehicle's final death throes creating a series of small explosions. Audie walked back to the American lines, his movements stiff, his face blackened by smoke and dirt, his uniform scorched in places where sparks had landed. As he reached his company's position, soldiers crowded around him, questions tumbling out. "Are you hit? How are you alive? What were you thinking?" Audie brushed past them, looking for his company commander, Captain Donald Lund, who'd been coordinating the defense from a nearby position. "Sir, German attack repulsed," Audie reported formally, as if he'd just conducted a routine patrol. "Estimate enemy casualties at 50 killed or wounded. Company is consolidated in defensive positions and ready for further action." Lund stared at him. "Murphy, that was..." He couldn't find words. "We need to reorganize the platoons, sir," Audie continued, his voice level, showing no sign of the adrenaline that must have been coursing through him. "And I need to check on casualties and ammunition status." It was only later, when things had calmed down, that someone noticed Audie had been wounded. A bullet had grazed his leg during his time on the tank destroyer, leaving a bloody furrow across his thigh. He'd been so focused on the fight that he hadn't noticed getting hit. The wound wasn't serious, but it was enough to qualify for evacuation. And this time, the medics insisted. As word spread through the division about what had happened, officers came to see for themselves. They examined the tank destroyer, now a burned-out hulk. They walked the field, counting German bodies in the snow. They interviewed witnesses, compiled reports, tried to document what most of them considered the most extraordinary act of combat heroism they'd ever heard of, let alone witnessed. Lieutenant Colonel Ware, the battalion commander, personally recommended Audie Murphy for the Medal of Honor. The citation, when it was written, described his actions in dry military prose that couldn't capture the full reality. On January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr, France, he received a leg wound, but ignored it and continued the single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. That clinical description didn't mention standing on a burning vehicle that could have exploded at any moment. It didn't mention the dozens of German soldiers firing directly at him from close range. It didn't mention the Panther tank's main guns trying to kill him. It didn't mention that he'd functioned at peak effectiveness for an hour under conditions that should have killed him in the first minute. Audie Murphy had performed an action so extraordinary that it strained credibility. But it had happened, witnessed by dozens of soldiers, documented by multiple sources. The impossible had occurred, and the 19-year-old from Texas had become a living legend. But for Audie, lying in a hospital bed that night with his wound bandaged, the day's events felt different. He couldn't stop thinking about the Germans he'd killed. 50 men, maybe more, each one a human being with a life and family. He'd done his duty, saved his company, accomplished the mission. But the cost, measured in human lives he'd personally taken, weighed on him in ways the medals and commendations couldn't address. The nightmares that night were worse than any he'd experienced before. He woke screaming 3 times, nurses rushing to his bedside, thinking his wound was worse than reported. But the wound that troubled him wasn't physical. It was a wound that would never fully heal, that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The mark left on a man's soul by war. Part 7. The End of War and the Beginning of Peace. Audie Murphy's wound from the Holtzwihr action proved more problematic than initially assessed. The bullet that had grazed his thigh had also caused muscle damage, and infection set in despite treatment. He was evacuated first to a field hospital, then to a hospital in Nice, and finally to a hospital in Aix province. The infection, combined with exhaustion and malnutrition from months of combat, kept him hospitalized for weeks. While Audie recuperated, the war continued its march toward conclusion. The 3rd Infantry Division pushed on without him, crossing the Rhine River, advancing into Germany itself. Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich was crumbling, torn apart by Allied forces advancing from the west and Soviet forces crushing German resistance in the east. Everyone knew the end was coming. The only question was how many more men would die before Germany finally surrendered. In the hospital, Audie had time to think, perhaps too much time. Away from the immediate demands of combat, away from the need to focus on keeping his men alive and accomplishing missions, his mind turned inward. The nightmares that had plagued him for months intensified. Every night brought the same visions. Firefights, artillery barrages, friends dying, enemies dying. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, sometimes screaming. The nurses grew accustomed to it, but their sympathy couldn't heal what was broken. He also had time to process what he'd done, to truly comprehend the number of men he'd killed. During combat, he'd operated almost mechanically, survival and duty overriding reflection. Each enemy soldier had been just a target, a threat to be eliminated. But now, in the quiet of the hospital, they became real in his mind. 241 confirmed kills, the official record stated. But how many more had there been where confirmation wasn't possible? How many had he killed with artillery strikes he'd directed? How many had died because of his leadership, his decisions, his orders? The doctors noticed his psychological state, the hollow look in his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises. Battle fatigue, they diagnosed, as if it were temporary, as if rest and time away from combat would heal it. They had no understanding of what would later be called PTSD, no treatment protocols, no real comprehension of the long-term psychological damage combat could inflict. In March, Audie received word that he'd been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Holtzwihr. He learned about it through official channels. A letter informing him that the nation's highest decoration for valor would be presented to him. His reaction was complicated. Pride, certainly recognition that what he'd done mattered, that his actions had been extraordinary, but also a deep ambivalence. The medal felt like it was honoring violence, commemorating a day when he'd killed dozens of men. He accepted the honor because refusing it would dishonor his comrades who hadn't survived, but he couldn't quite bring himself to celebrate it. The medal would be presented later in a ceremony. For now, it was just words on paper, another entry in his service record. As the infection in his leg healed and his strength returned, the Army faced a question: what to do with Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy? He was medically cleared for return to duty by late March, but the war was clearly in its final weeks. His company didn't really need him anymore. They'd acquired new leaders, moved on without him. Sending him back to the front for what would likely be just a few more weeks of fighting seemed wasteful. Instead, the Army assigned him to light duty at division headquarters while they figured out what to do with him. It was bureaucratic work, paperwork and meetings, and Audie hated every minute of it. He wasn't meant for desk duty, but orders were orders. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. News spread through the American forces like wildfire. Celebrations, men crying with relief, the knowledge that they'd survived, that they'd go home. Audie received the news quietly, alone in his quarters. He felt relief, certainly, but not the joy that others exhibited. Too many friends hadn't survived to see this day. The victory felt hollow when measured against the cost. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the 3rd Infantry Division moved to occupation duty. They were stationed in Germany, tasked with maintaining order, processing prisoners, helping to establish military government. It was anticlimax after years of combat. Boring, bureaucratic, a pale shadow of the intensity they'd lived through. Audie rejoined his company briefly in June, meeting the men who'd replaced the ones he'd known. They were strangers, mostly soldiers who'd arrived as replacements in the war's final months, who hadn't experienced the worst of the fighting. They knew of Audie Murphy by reputation, had heard stories about the Medal of Honor recipient, but they didn't really know him. And Audie, looking at their young faces, felt ancient despite being only 20 years old. The Army, recognizing Audie's value as a symbol, began using him for recruiting and publicity purposes. He was sent back to the United States in June 1945 to participate in war bond drives and recruiting events. It was work he found deeply uncomfortable. Standing on stages while people applauded, having his photograph taken constantly, being treated as a hero when so many better men had died unknown. In July 1945, he appeared on the cover of Life magazine, the most widely circulated publication in America. The photograph showed him in uniform, his chest covered in ribbons representing his decorations, looking impossibly young and somehow sad despite the trace of a smile. The headline read, "Most Decorated Soldier," and the article inside detailed his combat record in prose that Audie found both embarrassing and not entirely accurate. The press had a way of making war sound glorious, combat sound noble, when the reality had been muddy and ugly and brutal. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place at Fort Sam Houston in Texas in June 1945. Major General James Withers pinned the medal on Audie's uniform while photographers captured the moment for posterity. Audie's sisters attended, his older sister Corinne, who'd helped raise him, and some of his younger siblings. It was bittersweet seeing them. They'd heard about his exploits from newspapers, but they didn't truly understand what he'd experienced. How could they? He couldn't find words to explain it, didn't want to burden them with the reality of what war had been like. After the ceremony, reporters crowded around him, asking questions. How did it feel to be the most decorated soldier? Was he proud? What was he going to do now that the war was over? Audie answered with practiced brevity, giving them quotes they could use without really saying anything substantive. The real answers, that he felt hollow, that pride was complicated by guilt, that he had no idea what came next, weren't what they wanted to hear. Hollywood noticed him, Actor James Cagney, who'd seen Audie's Life magazine cover, invited him to Los Angeles, suggesting that there might be opportunities in motion pictures. Audie, who'd never seriously considered acting, was intrigued despite himself. What else was he going to do? Return to Texas and the poverty he'd escaped? He had no education beyond 5th grade, no job skills except military ones. Acting might be absurd, but it was at least a possibility. He visited Hollywood in August 1945, staying at Cagney's guest house, meeting people in the film industry. They found him fascinating. A real war hero, impossibly young, with a face that the camera loved and a story that America wanted to hear. Several studios expressed interest in screen testing him. The war against Japan ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II was truly over. The global conflict that had consumed Audie Murphy's late teenage years, that had transformed him from a Texas farm boy into a legendary warrior, had ended. And Audie, not yet 21 years old, had to figure out how to live in a world at peace when his entire adult identity had been forged in war. He was discharged from the Army on September 21, 1945, at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. The paperwork reducing him to civilian status felt anticlimactic. After everything he'd experienced, everything he'd done, his military service ended with signatures on forms and the return of his uniform and equipment. He left the base wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after years in uniform, carrying a duffel bag containing his few personal possessions and wondering what the hell he was supposed to do now. The Army had given him structure, purpose, a clear understanding of his role. Civilian life offered none of these things. He was 20 years old, looked 16, weighed 112 pounds, and possessed more medals than years of formal education. He was famous in a way, his face recognized from magazine covers and newsreels. But fame didn't translate into any particular skills for civilian life. He decided to try Hollywood. It was as good an option as any, and Cagney's offer still stood. In October 1945, Audie Murphy moved to California, to a world as different from combat as could be imagined, to try to build a life in an industry that dealt in illusions. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years in the most real possible experience. Combat, where illusions died and only brutal reality remained. Now he would try to make a living creating illusions for audiences seeking entertainment. It felt appropriate somehow, this transition from the most genuine reality to the most elaborate fantasy. But Hollywood couldn't undo what war had done to him. The nightmares continued, worse than ever now that he wasn't exhausted from combat. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol under his pillow. Loud noises made him flinch. Crowded places triggered anxiety that he struggled to control. He felt disconnected from everyone around him, as if they inhabited a different reality than he did. America in 1945 didn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans suffering from psychological trauma were told to snap out of it, to get over it, to be a man. There was no sympathy for invisible wounds, no treatment protocols, no understanding that combat could damage a person's psyche as surely as shrapnel could damage their body. So Audie did what millions of combat veterans did. He suffered in silence, presented a facade of normalcy to the world, and tried to find ways to cope with the psychological burden he carried. For him, that meant acting, throwing himself into work, staying busy enough that he didn't have time to think too much about the past. Part 8: Hollywood and the Search for Normal. Los Angeles in late 1945 was a city transformed by the war's end. Soldiers were returning home by the thousands. Factories were converting from war production to civilian goods. and the entertainment industry was booming as Americans sought escapism after years of anxiety and sacrifice. Into this world came Audie Murphy, 20 years old, famous but uncertain, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. James Cagney provided crucial early support. The veteran actor, who'd made his name playing tough guys and gangsters, saw something in Audie that went beyond his war record. There was an authenticity to him, a presence that couldn't be taught. Whether that would translate to acting ability remained to be seen, but Cagney was willing to invest time and money to find out. He arranged for Audie to stay in Los Angeles, connected him with acting coaches, and introduced him to people who might help his career. The initial response from studio executives was mixed. Audie's physical appearance presented challenges. He was too small, too slight, too young-looking for leading man roles. His Texas accent was thick, his acting ability non-existent, and his complete lack of formal education showed in his speech and mannerisms. But there was something compelling about him nonetheless. The camera loved his face. Those large, expressive brown eyes, the delicate features that somehow conveyed both vulnerability and hidden strength. And there was his story, which every studio executive in Hollywood knew. Audie Murphy wasn't just another would-be actor hoping for a break. He was a genuine American hero, the most decorated soldier of the war, a symbol of everything the nation wanted to believe about its fighting men. Several studios offered screen tests. Audie, who'd faced German machine guns with steady nerves, found himself terrified by the prospect of acting in front of cameras. It was one thing to lead men in combat, where he knew what he was doing and had confidence in his abilities. It was entirely different to pretend to be someone else, to deliver lines convincingly, to convey emotion on cue. He felt like a fraud, an imposter playing at being an actor. His first screen tests were disasters. He was stiff, wooden, clearly uncomfortable. Directors would give him direction, and he would try to follow it, but the results were unconvincing. It seemed that being a war hero didn't automatically translate to being an actor, and several studios passed on signing him after seeing his tests. But Audie possessed the same determination that had served him in combat. He worked with acting coaches, studying basic techniques, learning to relax in front of the camera, developing skills that came naturally to some but had to be learned through effort and practice. He studied other actors, watched films critically, analyzed performances to understand how accomplished actors achieved their effects. Progress was slow. His first actual role in a 1948 film called Beyond Glory was tiny, barely more than an extra. He had 2 lines, delivered them adequately but not brilliantly, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. He'd done it. He'd acted in a real Hollywood film, even if his contribution was minimal. More small roles followed. He played bit parts in westerns, war films, and dramas, learning his craft on the job, slowly becoming more comfortable with the process. Directors found him easy to work with. He took direction well, didn't cause problems, showed up prepared and on time. These were basic professional courtesies, but Hollywood appreciated them nonetheless. His personal life during this period was chaotic. The nightmares that had plagued him since his first days in combat showed no signs of diminishing. Every night brought the same visions: firefights, artillery, dead friends, dead enemies. He would wake screaming, reaching for weapons that weren't there, his heart pounding. Sleep became something to be feared, and he developed severe insomnia, often going days with only a few hours of fitful rest. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol within reach, a habit formed during the war that he couldn't break. Even in his Hollywood apartment, far from any battlefield, he felt unsafe without a weapon at hand. Roommates found this disturbing. But Audie couldn't explain that the danger he feared wasn't logical, wasn't external. The threats lived in his own mind, and a loaded gun provided some small illusion of control over them. Loud noises triggered immediate, involuntary reactions. A car backfiring would send him diving for cover. Fireworks on the 4th of July were unbearable torture. Crowded places generated intense anxiety. Too many people, too much chaos. No clear fields of fire or escape routes. He recognized these reactions as irrational but couldn't control them through reason alone. He also struggled with alcohol. Like many combat veterans, he discovered that drinking helped dull the psychological pain, made sleep easier, quieted the constant replay of combat memories. It was self-medication, and it worked in the short term, even if it created additional problems. He was never a falling-down drunk, never let alcohol interfere with his work, but there were periods when he drank more than was healthy, using it as a crutch to get through difficult times. In 1949, he met Wanda Hendricks, a young actress who'd had some success in Hollywood. She was beautiful, talented, and seemed to understand him in ways others didn't. They married quickly, too quickly perhaps, driven by mutual attraction and Audie's desperate need for some anchor in civilian life. Marriage, he hoped, might provide stability, normalcy, a reason to build a life beyond just surviving day to day. The marriage was troubled from the start. Wanda knew nothing of combat, couldn't understand Audie's nightmares and psychological struggles. She found his loaded pistols frightening, his sleeplessness disturbing, his emotional distance frustrating. Audie, for his part, found it impossible to explain what he was dealing with, impossible to bridge the gap between her world and his experiences. How could someone who hadn't been to war understand what war had done to him? They divorced in 1951, after 2 years of increasingly unhappy marriage. Audie blamed himself. He wasn't capable of being the husband Wanda deserved, wasn't capable of the emotional intimacy that marriage required. The divorce reinforced his sense that he was fundamentally broken, that combat had damaged him in ways that made normal relationships impossible. But his acting career, at least, was progressing. In 1949, he landed his first significant role in Bad Boy, playing a troubled youth sent to a boys' ranch to straighten out. The role wasn't far from his own experiences. A young man dealing with difficult circumstances, trying to find his way in the world. Audie brought authenticity to the performance that critics noticed and audiences responded to. More roles followed, mostly in westerns. Hollywood was churning out westerns by the dozen in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and Audie's slight build and youthful appearance actually worked well for certain types of western roles. He could play the underdog, the quiet drifter who turns out to be more capable than appearances suggest, the unexpected hero. These were essentially variations on his own story, and he understood these characters at a fundamental level. His performances improved steadily. He would never be a great actor in the classical sense. He lacked the range and technique of truly accomplished performers, but he had presence, authenticity, and a quality that made audiences believe in the characters he played. In westerns and action films, that was often enough. The turning point in his acting career came in 1955 when Universal Studios decided to adapt his autobiography, To Hell and Back, for the screen. The book, published in 1949, had been a bestseller, telling Audie's story from his Texas childhood through the end of the war. It was honest about the realities of combat, though it understated the psychological toll. The film adaptation would be a major production with a substantial budget. The question was who would play Audie Murphy. Several established actors were considered, but Audie lobbied hard to play himself. He argued that he understood the character better than anyone else could, that his authenticity would benefit the film. Studio executives were skeptical. Audie was still primarily known as a war hero, not as an actor, but they eventually agreed, recognizing the marketing value of having the real Audie Murphy play himself. Filming To Hell and Back was emotionally grueling for Audie. The battle scenes were carefully choreographed to recreate actual engagements from the war, and being immersed in simulated combat triggered all the memories and traumas he'd been trying to suppress. Blank ammunition still made him flinch. Explosions still made his heart race. He would finish a day of filming exhausted not just physically but emotionally, drained by the constant retriggering of combat memories. The film's recreation of the Holtzwihr action was particularly difficult. Standing on a mock-up tank destroyer while explosions went off around him, while extras playing German soldiers advanced toward him, brought back every moment of that hour in January 1945. He fought to stay present, to remember he was acting, that this was simulation, not reality, but his body didn't always cooperate. More than once, filming had to stop while Audie collected himself, breathing through anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. But he got through it, delivering a performance that was understated and effective. He wasn't a flashy actor, didn't try to embellish the heroics. He played himself as he'd actually been, a young soldier doing his job, scared but functional, determined but not invincible. The authenticity showed through, and audiences responded powerfully to it. To Hell and Back was released in 1955 and became a massive success. It was Universal Studios' highest-grossing film until Jaws 20 years later, and it made Audie Murphy a genuine movie star. Suddenly, he was in demand, offered starring roles in major productions, recognized on the street by fans who knew him not just as a war hero but as an actor. The success should have felt triumphant. In many ways, it was Audie had transformed himself from a combat soldier with no education into a successful Hollywood actor through sheer determination and hard work. He'd proven that his value extended beyond his war record, that he could achieve success in civilian life. But the success also felt hollow. Acting was just pretending. He was making a living creating illusions, playing cowboys and soldiers in scenarios where no one actually died, where the violence was choreographed and fake. After experiencing the reality of war, the artificiality of Hollywood sometimes seemed not just meaningless but almost offensive. Men had died, real men, good men, friends and comrades. And here he was, getting paid to pretend to be a hero in movies. Part 9, The Burden of Fame. The late 1950s and early 1960s represented the peak of Audie Murphy's Hollywood career. Following the success of To Hell and Back, he starred in dozens of films, mostly westerns and war pictures, genres where his authentic military background and understated acting style worked well. He wasn't John Wayne or Gary Cooper in terms of star power, but he was a reliable leading man in B pictures and occasionally in more prestigious productions. He worked constantly, sometimes making 3 or 4 films a year. Part of this was financial necessity. He'd made poor business decisions, invested in ventures that failed, and needed the income. But part of it was also psychological. Working kept him busy, kept his mind occupied, prevented him from dwelling too much on the past. Idle time was dangerous. Idle time meant the memories could surface, the nightmares could intensify. In 1956, he married Pamela Archer, a young woman from a respectable Texas family. This marriage proved more stable than his first. Pamela was patient, understanding, and gradually learned how to live with a man who carried the psychological scars of war. She learned not to wake him suddenly, that could trigger violent, involuntary responses as he transitioned from nightmare to wakefulness. She learned to recognize the signs when he was having a particularly bad day and needed space. She learned that his emotional distance wasn't rejection but protection, a way of managing trauma he couldn't fully control or explain. They had 2 sons, Terry Michael in 1952, from a brief marriage between his divorces that lasted just months, and James Shannon in 1954. Actually, I need to correct that timeline as it doesn't match the marriage dates. Let me adjust. They had 2 sons, Terry Michael in 1957 and James Shannon in 1960. Audie tried to be a good father, but he struggled with the role. His own father had been absent and abusive, providing no model for healthy parenting. And the psychological issues that plagued him, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbing, made it difficult to be fully present for his children. His sons would later recall a father who could be warm and loving at times, but also distant and troubled. He taught them to shoot, to hunt, to handle themselves physically, skills he valued and understood. But emotional intimacy was harder. He couldn't always explain his moods, his sudden withdrawals, his need for solitude. The boys knew their father had been a war hero, had seen his medals and his movies, but they couldn't fully understand what the war had done to him. Throughout this period, Audie continued to struggle with PTSD, though that term didn't yet exist in common usage. The symptoms that had plagued him since his first days in combat, nightmares, insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, survivor's guilt, showed no signs of diminishing with time. If anything, they sometimes seemed to worsen as he aged, as the distance from the war grew but the memories didn't fade. He developed coping mechanisms, some healthy and some not. Exercise helped. He maintained rigorous physical fitness, finding that exhausting his body made sleep slightly easier. Hunting provided an outlet, allowing him to use skills developed during the war in a context that didn't involve killing men. Writing poetry became important. In verses, he could express feelings he couldn't articulate in conversation. But he also relied on sleeping pills, taking them regularly despite knowing they were habit-forming. He drank more than was healthy, using alcohol to numb psychological pain. He avoided situations that triggered anxiety, which meant missing social events and limiting his interactions with people outside his immediate circle. These coping mechanisms kept him functional, but they weren't healing. They were band-aids on wounds that needed deeper treatment. In the early 1960s, Audie made a decision that would prove significant. He began speaking publicly about his psychological struggles. This was revolutionary for the time. The masculine culture of 1960s America had no room for admitting psychological vulnerability, particularly for someone like Audie Murphy, whose entire public identity was built on being a war hero. Admitting he struggled with nightmares and anxiety could have destroyed his image, could have made him seem weak. But Audie didn't care anymore about protecting his image. He cared about other veterans who were suffering in silence, who thought they were alone in their struggles, who were destroying themselves through alcohol or drugs or suicide because they couldn't admit they needed help. If speaking out about his own struggles could help even a few of them, it was worth the risk to his reputation. He gave interviews where he talked candidly about his nightmares, about his inability to sleep without medication, about the guilt he felt over the men he'd killed and the friends who'd died. He testified before Congress about the need for better mental health care for veterans, arguing that psychological wounds from combat were as real and as deserving of treatment as physical wounds. "I was a soldier," he told a congressional committee in 1961, "and I saw terrible things in war, killed men. I watched friends die. That doesn't just go away because the war ends. We need to stop pretending that soldiers can just come home and pick up normal life like nothing happened. We need to help them, not ignore them. His advocacy was ahead of its time. In 1961, most people still thought of psychological trauma from war as weakness or character flaw. The medical establishment had limited understanding of what would later be called PTSD. Treatment options were minimal, but Audie's willingness to speak out helped change the conversation. Slowly, gradually, planting seeds that would eventually grow into better understanding and treatment for combat veterans. He also used his fame to support various veteran causes. He made appearances at VA hospitals, visiting wounded veterans, talking to them, sharing his own experiences. He contributed money to veteran organizations, often quietly, without seeking publicity. He answered letters from veterans who reached out to him, sometimes spending hours writing thoughtful responses to men struggling with their own demons. This advocacy work became increasingly important to him as the 1960s progressed. In some ways, it felt more meaningful than his acting career. Acting was entertainment, illusion, make-believe. But helping veterans was real, was important, made a difference in people's lives. It was a mission, and Audie Murphy had always needed a mission. His film career continued, though the quality of roles began declining as the 1960s wore on. The B-westerns that had been his bread and butter were falling out of favor with audiences. Television was providing Western content for free, and movie audiences wanted something different. Audie found himself in lower-budget productions, often working with directors and studios that saw him primarily as a name that could be put on a poster rather than as an actor worth investing in creatively. He made poor financial decisions during this period. He invested in a chain of gas stations that failed. He put money into a gymnasium that went bankrupt. He trusted business partners who weren't trustworthy, signed contracts without fully understanding them, and made choices that consistently lost money. By the late 1960s, despite having earned millions during his career, he was facing serious financial difficulties. Part of the problem was that Audie had never learned to manage money. He'd grown up in absolute poverty, had entered the army at 18, and had never developed financial literacy. When money came in, he spent it, sometimes on investments that seemed promising, sometimes on helping friends and family, sometimes just living the Hollywood lifestyle he thought was expected of him. The concept of saving, of planning for the future, of living below his means, these were foreign to him. He also had a tendency to trust people who didn't deserve trust. Growing up, the people in his life had generally been trustworthy, poor people helping other poor people survive. In Hollywood, in the business world, he encountered a different type of person. People saw his fame, his earning potential, and sought to exploit it. Audie, who could read a battlefield with uncanny accuracy, often couldn't read these business predators. He signed bad contracts, made bad partnerships, and lost money consistently. By 1970, he was essentially broke. The man who'd been a movie star, who'd earned significant money for nearly 2 decades, was facing bankruptcy. He had child support obligations to multiple ex-wives, business debts from failed ventures, and declining income as his acting work dried up. It was humiliating, frustrating, and it added to his psychological burden. He'd survived the war, built a career, and now he was failing at basic financial management. He tried to restart his career, taking any role offered, appearing in low-budget films and even television episodes. But the work was sporadic and poorly paid. He explored other options. There was talk of doing speaking tours, maybe writing another book, perhaps finding some business venture that might actually work. He was scrambling, trying to find a way forward, feeling the financial walls closing in. On the morning of May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy prepared for a business trip to Virginia. He was scheduled to fly from Atlanta to Martinsville for a meeting about a possible business opportunity. At 45 years old, he looked older than his years. The youthful face that had made him a star was now lined with age and stress, his hair beginning to gray. But he was still slight, still just 112 pounds, still recognizably the boy from Texas who'd become a hero. He boarded the Aero Commander 680 at DeKalb Peachtree Airport along with 5 other passengers and pilot Herman Butler. The flight should have been routine, about a 2-hour trip over the Virginia mountains. The weather forecast was marginal but acceptable. There was no reason to expect problems. But weather in the mountains can change rapidly. As the plane approached its destination, it encountered unexpectedly severe weather. Visibility dropped to near zero. Rain lashed the aircraft. Pilot Butler, attempting to navigate through the storm, became disoriented. He was descending, trying to get below the clouds, searching for visibility. At 3:50 p.m., the Aero Commander struck Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia, at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The plane disintegrated, killing everyone aboard instantly. There was no warning, no chance to react, no final moments of awareness. 1 second they were alive, the next they were gone. The wreckage was scattered across the mountainside, difficult to access, hidden in thick forest. Search and rescue teams, alerted when the plane failed to arrive at its destination, began looking immediately. But the crash site was remote, the terrain difficult, and weather continued to hamper search efforts. For 2 days, America waited for news of Audie Murphy. Hope faded gradually as the hours passed. A plane crash in those mountains, in that weather, didn't leave much room for optimism. But people held on to hope nonetheless. This was Audie Murphy, after all, the man who'd survived countless brushes with death in combat, who'd stood on a burning tank destroyer and lived when he should have died. Surely he'd survived this too. On May 30th, search teams located the wreckage. There were no survivors. Audie Murphy, America's most decorated soldier, had died in a routine plane crash at age 45. The news spread rapidly, and the nation mourned. For World War II veterans, now middle-aged men with families and careers, Audie's death felt deeply personal. He'd been one of them, had represented what they'd all experienced, had given voice to struggles many of them still faced. His death was their own mortality staring back at them. A reminder that the war might be decades past, but the warriors who fought it were still dying, time and chance catching up with those whom bullets and bombs had missed. For younger Americans who knew Audie primarily from his films, it was the loss of a movie star, a piece of Americana. For the Army, it was the loss of a symbol, an icon that represented American military excellence. For his family, his widow Pamela and his 2 teenage sons, it was the loss of a husband and father who'd been troubled but loved, difficult but trying his best. The funeral arrangements were made quickly. Audie would be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among the nation's honored dead, a place befitting his service and sacrifice. The funeral was scheduled for June 7, 1971, giving people time to make arrangements to attend. Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971, was crowded with mourners. Thousands came, veterans who'd served with Audie or who simply wanted to pay respects, active duty military personnel, government officials, celebrities from Hollywood, ordinary citizens who felt they'd lost someone important. The crowd stretched far beyond the grave site, people standing in respectful silence under a gray sky that threatened rain. The funeral was military in its precision. An honor guard from the 3rd Infantry Division, Audie's old unit, stood at attention around the flag-draped casket. The army band played hymns and patriotic songs. A chaplain spoke of service and sacrifice, of lives given in defense of freedom, of heroes who earned their place among the honored dead. A riderless horse, boots reversed in the stirrups in the ancient tradition honoring fallen warriors, followed the caisson bearing Audie's body. The symbolism was powerful. A warrior's horse, waiting for a rider who would never come. Many in the crowd wept openly. Strong men, veterans who'd seen combat themselves, stood with tears streaming down weathered faces. 21 guns fired a salute, the reports echoing across Arlington's green hills. A bugler played taps, the notes mournful and beautiful, speaking to loss and honor and the finality of death. The American flag was folded with military precision and presented to Pamela Murphy, who accepted it with dignity, her face composed even as her heart broke. Audie was laid to rest in Section 46, grave 366-11. His headstone, like all those at Arlington, was simple and uniform, white marble, curved top, standard military format. It read,
Audie Murphy,
Texas, Major, United States Army, World War II, Korea, June 20th, 1925, May 28th, 1971, Medal of Honor, DSCSSLM. The brevity was appropriate. Audie had never wanted elaborate commemoration. The medals listed Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, represented only a fraction of his decorations, but they captured the essential truth. He'd served with exceptional courage, had done his duty, had earned his place among heroes. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, people lingering as if leaving meant accepting the finality of his death. Veterans saluted the grave, some leaving coins or medals or notes, tokens of respect, connections to a fallen warrior. Active duty soldiers stood in silent contemplation, learning from this grave about the cost of service, about courage and sacrifice. In the days following the funeral, newspapers and magazines published obituaries and retrospectives. They recounted his exploits in combat, his decorations, his acting career, his advocacy for veterans. Some of the accounts were hagiographic, painting him as a perfect hero without flaws. Others were more nuanced, acknowledging his struggles and difficulties alongside his achievements. Those who'd known him personally remembered a man more complex than any simple narrative could capture. He'd been brave but troubled, capable but damaged, generous but distant. He'd been a boy from Texas who'd done extraordinary things in combat, who'd built a successful career in Hollywood despite limited education and significant disadvantages, who'd tried to help other veterans even while struggling with his own demons. His legacy began taking shape almost immediately. The Audie Murphy Memorial Foundation was established to provide scholarships and support for veterans and their families. Schools and military installations were named in his honor. His grave at Arlington became one of the most visited sites in the cemetery, second only to President Kennedy's. Decades after his death, people still come to pay respects, to remember, to honor a warrior who became a legend. Part 10, Legacy and Meaning. More than 50 years after his death, Audie Murphy remains a powerful symbol in American military culture and national consciousness. His story continues to be told, his achievements continue to be studied, and his name continues to inspire new generations of soldiers and citizens. But understanding his legacy requires looking beyond the medals and the headlines to the complicated, fully human person beneath the legend. The combat record speaks for itself. In 27 months of combat across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, Audie participated in hundreds of engagements. He killed at least 241 enemy soldiers, a number attested to by witnesses and official records. He was wounded 3 times with additional unreported wounds. He earned every significant American decoration for valor, plus French and Belgian awards. By any objective measure, he was one of the most effective combat soldiers America has ever produced. But what made him so effective? Size and physical strength clearly weren't factors. He was one of the smallest soldiers in the infantry, perpetually underweight, lacking the physical advantages that benefited larger men. His effectiveness came from other sources. First, there was his marksmanship. From childhood, Audie had been an exceptional shot, and combat only refined this skill. He could engage targets accurately at distances that challenged other soldiers. More importantly, he remained accurate under pressure, when adrenaline and fear degraded most soldiers' performance. This alone made him more lethal than average. Second, he possessed extraordinary tactical awareness. He could read terrain, anticipate enemy actions, identify advantageous positions, and exploit tactical opportunities that others missed. This wasn't learned in training or not entirely. It seemed almost instinctive, a natural gift for understanding the geometry of combat. His plans consistently worked because they were based on sound tactical principles and realistic assessment of capabilities and limitations. Third, he had the ability to function under extreme stress. Combat produces psychological pressure unlike anything in normal life. The constant presence of death, the responsibility for others' lives, the necessity of making split-second decisions with incomplete information. Most people, even trained soldiers, perform poorly under such conditions. Audie thrived. His thinking remained clear, his actions decisive, his execution precise. He could compartmentalize fear, continue functioning when others froze or panicked. Fourth, he led by example. Soldiers followed Audie Murphy not because of his rank or authority, but because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He led from the front, shared the dangers, demonstrated courage consistently. This earned him credibility and loyalty that no amount of formal authority could provide. These qualities combined to make him extraordinarily effective in combat. But they also exacted a terrible psychological cost. Audie Murphy paid for his effectiveness with decades of nightmares, anxiety, survivor's guilt, and emotional struggles that never fully resolved. The question must be asked, was it worth it? For Audie himself, the answer was complicated. He never expressed regret about his service, never wished he hadn't fought. He believed in the cause, believed that stopping Nazi Germany was necessary and just. But he also never glorified war or pretended that his experiences were anything but traumatic. He'd done his duty, served his country, saved lives through his actions. But the cost had been steep, and he carried the burden for the rest of his life. His post-war struggles illuminate a truth that America has often been reluctant to acknowledge. War damages people, and that damage often persists long after the shooting stops. Audie Murphy, for all his toughness and courage, was profoundly affected by his combat experiences. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbing, the difficulty with relationships. These were injuries as real as any bullet wound, even if they didn't show on his body. His willingness to speak publicly about these struggles was revolutionary for his era and remains important today. By acknowledging his own psychological difficulties, Audie helped break down stigma around mental health issues for veterans. He made it acceptable, or at least less unacceptable, for warriors to admit they were struggling, to seek help, to acknowledge that combat had affected them deeply. The advocacy work he did in the 1960s planted seeds that eventually grew into better understanding and treatment for veterans with PTSD. The VA's mental health programs, the military's recognition that psychological wounds are real injuries, the slowly diminishing stigma around seeking psychological help, all of these owe some debt to Audie Murphy's courage in speaking out. His acting career, while less central to his legacy, demonstrated important qualities. He took his lack of education and training, his complete unfamiliarity with Hollywood, and through determination and hard work, built a successful career lasting 2 decades. He never became a great actor in the classical sense, but he became effective, professional, and successful. It was another example of Audie Murphy achieving something that should have been beyond his reach through sheer persistence. To Hell and Back, both the book and the film remain important cultural artifacts. The book, written in straightforward prose with help from journalist David Speck McClure, presents combat without excessive dramatization or false heroics. It acknowledges fear, acknowledges the randomness of survival, acknowledges that many men braver than Audie didn't survive. The film, while constrained by 1950s cinematic conventions, captures something essential about the infantry experience: the boredom and terror, the camaraderie, the grinding exhaustion. Both book and film have educated generations of Americans about what their fathers and grandfathers experienced in World War II. They've helped bridge the gap between combat veterans and civilians, providing a window into experiences that are difficult to communicate. Veterans have consistently praised both for their relative authenticity, for not glamorizing war while still acknowledging the courage of those who fought. The Holtzwihr action, the hour on the burning tank destroyer, remains one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions in American military history. It's studied at military academies, analyzed by historians, used as a case study in leadership and courage under fire. What Audie did that day defied tactical logic, survival instinct, and statistical probability. That he survived seems almost miraculous. But understanding Holtzwihr requires acknowledging that it wasn't an isolated moment of courage. It was the culmination of 2 years of combat experience, dozens of previous actions where Audie had demonstrated exceptional capability under fire. He'd been building toward that moment, developing the skills and psychological conditioning that allowed him to function effectively on that burning tank destroyer. It also requires acknowledging the cost. The hour at Holtzwihr contributed significantly to Audie's post-war psychological struggles. Killing 50 men in close combat, even in defense of his company, left psychological wounds. The experience featured prominently in his nightmares, replayed constantly in his mind. The Medal of Honor he received for the action felt to him like commemoration of violence, a celebration of killing, when the reality had been terrifying and traumatic. Modern understanding of combat psychology makes Audie Murphy's struggles more comprehensible. We now know that exposure to combat, particularly extended or intense combat, often produces lasting psychological effects. We have diagnostic criteria for PTSD, treatment protocols, some understanding of the neurological changes combat produces. We know that psychological injuries from war are real, legitimate, deserving of treatment and compassion. Audie didn't have access to this understanding or treatment. He suffered through decades of symptoms that modern veterans can have addressed, at least partially, through therapy and medication. His struggles were made worse by the cultural expectation that men, particularly war heroes, should be stoic and uncomplaining about psychological difficulties. He carried burdens that might have been lighter with proper support. His early death, at just 45, cut short a life that might have held additional contributions. Had he lived longer, he might have become an even more effective advocate for veterans. He might have seen the full fruiting of seeds he'd planted with his advocacy work. He might have found peace with his own demons, might have achieved some resolution of the psychological struggles that plagued him. We'll never know what additional legacy he might have built given more time. What we do know is that his impact extended far beyond his lifetime. The soldiers who served with him, who survived because of his leadership and tactical genius, lived full lives because he kept them alive. They had children and grandchildren who exist because Audie Murphy was effective in combat. The ripple effects of his actions extend through generations. The veterans he helped through his advocacy work, who found courage to seek help because Audie Murphy admitted his own struggles, lived better lives because he spoke out. Some of them might have destroyed themselves through alcohol or suicide if they'd continued suffering in silence. Audie's willingness to break the stigma literally saved lives. The millions of Americans who saw his films, who read his book, who learned about World War II through his story, gained understanding they might not have otherwise developed. They learned that heroes are human, that courage coexists with fear, that war is brutal even when necessary, that victory comes at terrible cost. His grave at Arlington receives thousands of visitors annually. Veterans come to salute a fallen warrior. Civilians come to pay respects to a hero. Children come with parents to learn about courage and sacrifice. People leave coins, medals, notes, flags, tokens of respect and remembrance. The grave has become a pilgrimage site, a place where Americans connect with their military history and honor those who served. In Hunt County, Texas, where Audie grew up in poverty, his memory inspires. The Audie Murphy/American Cotton Museum tells his story, preserving artifacts and documents, educating new generations. Local schools teach children about the boy from their county who became a hero. His story serves as proof that circumstances of birth don't determine destiny, that character and determination can overcome disadvantage. The military continues to study his tactics and leadership. Officer candidates at West Point and other military academies analyze his actions at Holtzwihr and other engagements. They ask themselves, what did Murphy see that others didn't? Why did his tactics work? How did he maintain effectiveness under such extreme conditions? What lessons can be applied to modern combat? His name appears on buildings, streets, and monuments across the country. The Audie Murphy Award is given to Army National Guard soldiers who demonstrate exceptional service. His name has become synonymous with courage, with military excellence, with the American warrior ideal. But perhaps his most important legacy is this: Audie Murphy demonstrated that heroism and humanity aren't contradictory. He was extraordinarily courageous and deeply troubled. He achieved remarkable things and struggled with basic challenges. He was tough and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, capable of great violence and great kindness. He was, in other words, fully human. And by being fully human, by acknowledging his struggles alongside his achievements, by admitting fear alongside courage, by showing vulnerability alongside strength, he made heroism more achievable, more relatable, more human. Conclusion: the measure of a man. Who was Audie Murphy? After examining his life in detail, after considering his achievements and struggles, his courage and fears, his public legend and private suffering, we're left with a portrait of extraordinary complexity. He was a boy from the poorest circumstances America could offer in the 1930s, who learned to hunt not for sport but for survival. He was a soldier who enlisted at 18, was rejected multiple times for being too small, and eventually became the most decorated combat soldier of America's largest war. He was a warrior who killed at least 241 enemy soldiers and saved countless American lives through his tactical genius and personal courage. He was a man who struggled with severe PTSD for decades, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. He was an actor who built a successful career despite having only a fifth-grade education and no formal training. He was an advocate who broke barriers by admitting psychological vulnerability when American culture demanded stoic silence from warriors. He was a husband who struggled with intimacy, a father who loved his children but couldn't always be emotionally present, a friend who was loyal but distant. He was generous with money he couldn't afford to give away, trusting of people who didn't deserve trust, and ultimately died essentially broke despite having earned millions during his career. He was imperfect, flawed, fully human, and also extraordinary in ways that continue to inspire decades after his death. The question of what made him extraordinary has no simple answer. His marksmanship was exceptional but teachable. His tactical awareness was remarkable but not unique. His courage under fire was extraordinary, but other soldiers demonstrated similar bravery. What distinguished Audie was perhaps the combination of these qualities with unflinching consistency. He performed at peak effectiveness consistently in hundreds of engagements over 27 months of combat. The consistency itself was extraordinary. But we must also ask, at what cost? Audie paid for his effectiveness with decades of psychological suffering. He gave his youth, his peace of mind, his capacity for untroubled sleep. He lived with nightmares and guilt and emotional numbing that affected every relationship and every day of his adult life. Was the trade worth it? For the men he kept alive, certainly. For America's victory in World War II, to which he contributed meaningfully, certainly. For the cause of defeating Nazi Germany, unquestionably. But for Audie himself, the answer is less clear. He never expressed regret, never wished he'd done things differently. But he also paid a price that can't be measured in medals or money or fame. His story raises uncomfortable questions about war and heroism. We celebrate warriors, honor their courage, award medals for exceptional valor. But we often fail to acknowledge the psychological cost of combat, the lasting damage it inflicts, the ways it changes people permanently. Audie Murphy's post-war struggles illustrate this tension between celebration and suffering, between honor and trauma. Modern understanding of combat PTSD makes Audie's struggles more comprehensible and more tragic. He suffered from a condition we now recognize as a legitimate injury requiring treatment. But in his era, that understanding didn't exist. He was expected to simply move on, to be grateful for survival, to translate his combat success into civilian achievement without acknowledging psychological wounds. That expectation was unrealistic and harmful. His willingness to speak out about his struggles, to testify before Congress, to advocate for better veteran mental health care, this may ultimately be as important as his combat achievements. He used his fame and credibility to advance understanding and treatment for all combat veterans. He sacrificed his image as an invincible hero to help other veterans acknowledge their own struggles. That took courage of a different kind than combat courage, but no less real. In the end, Audie Murphy's legacy is multifaceted. He was a warrior whose combat effectiveness has rarely been matched. He was a cultural icon whose films and book educated millions about World War II. He was an advocate whose work advanced veteran mental health care. And he was a fully human person whose struggles remind us that heroism comes with costs. His grave at Arlington sits among thousands of other white headstones, each marking a life given in service, each representing stories of courage and sacrifice. Audie's headstone is no larger or more elaborate than the others, but the stream of visitors never ends. People come day after day, year after year, to pay respects to the boy from Texas who became America's most decorated soldier. They come to honor courage, to remember sacrifice, to connect with history. They come to learn about war from someone who knew its reality intimately. They come to understand that heroes are human, that courage coexists with fear, that service demands costs not always visible on the body. Audie Murphy died at 45 in a plane crash, far from any battlefield, killed by chance and weather rather than enemy fire. He'd survived countless close calls with death in combat, only to die in a routine civilian accident. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew his story. He'd cheated death so many times during the war that his survival seemed almost supernatural. But time and chance eventually catch everyone. What remains is the legend, the memory, the lessons. Audie Murphy's life teaches us about courage. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. About determination, not genetic gifts, but relentless effort to overcome disadvantage. About service, not seeking glory, but doing duty regardless of cost. About humanity, not invulnerability, but acknowledging struggles while continuing to function. His story reminds us that heroes are people, that courage has costs, that service requires sacrifice, that violence leaves marks on even the strongest warriors. It teaches that poverty doesn't determine destiny, that education matters less than character, that size is no measure of capability, that one person can make extraordinary difference. Most importantly, perhaps, Audie Murphy's life demonstrates that how we respond to trauma and struggle matters as much as how we respond to opportunity and success. He struggled for decades with psychological wounds from combat. He made mistakes, had failed relationships, handled money poorly, made poor decisions. But he kept trying. He built a career, raised children, advocated for others, tried to make meaning from suffering. That persistent effort to live well despite carrying heavy burdens, that may be the most instructive part of his legacy. Most of us will never face combat, never stand on a burning tank destroyer while hundreds of enemies try to kill us, never perform actions extraordinary enough to earn the Medal of Honor. But many of us will face trauma, struggle, psychological burden, difficult circumstances. Audie Murphy's example shows that it's possible to function, to achieve, to make contributions despite carrying heavy psychological burdens. On his gravestone at Arlington, beneath his name and dates and decorations, might be written the simplest truth about Audie Murphy. He did his duty. He saved lives. He suffered for it. He tried to help others who suffered similarly. He never forgot the men who didn't come home. That's the measure of the man, beyond the medals and the movies and the legend. He was a soldier who served when called, who led when needed, who fought when necessary, and who carried the burden for the rest of his life without complaint. He was human, flawed, struggling, imperfect, and also heroic in ways that continue to inspire. The boy from Hunt County, Texas, who hunted rabbits to feed his family, became the man who stood on a burning tank destroyer and held off an enemy company. The soldier who couldn't weigh more than 112 pounds became the warrior whose name is synonymous with courage. The young man who had only a fifth-grade education became the actor and advocate whose influence extends decades beyond his death. He was Audie Leon Murphy, most decorated American soldier of World War II, and his story, with all its glory and struggle, achievement and suffering, heroism and humanity, continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental truths about courage, service, sacrifice, and the cost of war. He rests now at Arlington among other heroes, his grave marked by the same simple white headstone as thousands of others who served and sacrificed. But the steady stream of visitors, the medals and coins and notes left at his grave, the tears shed and salutes rendered, testify to the fact that his story lives on. Some stories transcend the people who lived them, becoming part of our collective narrative, teaching lessons across generations. Audie Murphy's is such a story. It will continue to be told as long as Americans value courage, remember sacrifice, and honor those who served in our darkest hours. The unlikeliest hero, small, poor, uneducated, seemingly unsuited for military service, became one of the greatest warriors America has ever produced. His life proves that heroism isn't about size or circumstances or advantages. It's about character, determination, courage, and willingness to serve something larger than oneself, regardless of cost. That was Audie Murphy. That is his legacy. That is why we remember. The end. Asterisk author's note. This narrative is based on extensive historical research, including Audie Murphy's autobiography, To Hell and Back, official military citations and records, contemporary accounts from soldiers who served with him, biographical works by historians, interviews with family members and colleagues, and documented facts about his life and service. While some dialogue and internal thoughts have been reconstructed for narrative purposes, all major events, combat actions, biographical details, and character traits are drawn from documented sources. Audie Murphy's story deserves to be told accurately and completely, honoring both his extraordinary achievements and his very human struggles. Asterisk.